chairs and plug them down. The inquiry is resumed. Before we move on to hear from Ms. McGinn, I want to run through several bits of housekeeping. Overnight and this morning I've received several documents. I'll run through them. Civil compliance schedule on the table. Confirmation of acceptance of the pre-commencement conditions. Final Section 106 agreement. Schedule of case law from Mr. Stinchcombe. And submissions from P. Palamchuk, D. Tolkacheva, and L. Love. You received those yet? And an agreed list of conditions. Now, reflecting on the issues that I identified at the opening of the inquiry, it strikes me that I could compress them and deal with just a single issue, which would be whether the proposal would accord with the objectives of the joint core strategy, and particularly policy 36 when read as a whole, and if not, whether there are any material considerations that would justify the proposal. Having heard and read everything over these 2 weeks, that encompasses everything that we need to cover.
I'll not use my friend. So we would respectfully suggest that there is one additional issue, and that it may well be rolled up in policy 36, but that's where the mitigation hierarchy provided for by paragraph 180 of the framework is also complied with. But it may well be rolled up in your understanding of the requirements of policy 36.
I can find where I put policy 36. Strikes me that that's covered by 36E.
So it's certainly
slightest reading.
that's fine. It is covered. It's related to. We would say that there is a freestanding aspect of national planning policy that requires to be applied. But I can readily see how ecological issues are certainly tied up in policy 36.
You're going to refer to that fully in your closing. But in general,
we're content with that formulation.
is there anything you want to raise before we move on?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, there have been 3 of the people who spoke on Wednesday evening and have asked for what they've said to be handed in. They're Paul Hanson, Agostino, and Leanne Robinson. So I've just got copies of those. And also, so we were going to rely on, I think, mainly we're going to rely on the same case law that Mr. Stinchcombe's links has provided to you. Mr. Simons also provided a list of cases yesterday. I don't think any of the contentions in the case laws are contentious. I doubt it. So we've just quoted sections. Now, if you want all the cases, then we can give them to you, or we can give you links to them, but we haven't done that yet. But,
well, I was going to suggest that the various cases that are going to be referred to are added to the core documents.
Okay.
That's certainly do that. So,
And then they'll be there,
That's fine.
and then I can link to them.
We'll take ownership of that now.
yes,
Okay.
that'd be great.
We'll put the link to the cases in the core document list.
Do you want us to, can you get the ones we've sent?
Yes, of course.
That's great. Thank you very much.
I can, if we're going to publish them on our website, yeah, that'll be fine. Yeah, yeah.
Anything you wish to raise, Mr. Simons?
No, thank you.
Anything else, Mr. Stinch?
No, sir.
Shall we see if we can raise?
Hopefully she's still there.
Let's begin. Not letting me in.
Let me in. So let people in the meeting know you're late. Who's managing?
Who's managing the
Might it was going to be that lady who
No. Something's happening.
Hi.
Oh, good morning. Let's begin. Let's begin.
Yeah, thanks for your time this morning.
Right.
So,
Would you like to commence with your submission?
I would, yes, thank you. In more Teams, I have a short presentation to show, so I feel that just summarises my pieces a little easier. So, okay. So, save weekly work. Save weekly woods. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the three reasons we need to save weekly woods are climate change based on the government strategy of the earth, properties, ESG responsibilities, and the overall impact based on community and wildlife. Climate change, as you know, became the first major economy to pass into law a domestic requirement for net zero greenhouse gases. Only 12% of land area, according to Friends of the Earth, has trees. So I'd like to know how this development aligns with the government's climate change strategy and climate change act, especially since cutting down the wood actually releases carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
The proposal does not involve any of the woodland.
Okay, yeah, even so with meadows, it still kind of involves getting rid of a lot of our nature and wildlife and sort of, things that would be involved with.
As long as you're aware that it doesn't involve removal of the woodland.
Okay, that's good to know, because I haven't sort of been aware, because originally we were getting rid of a lot of our walking space. So even so with sort of climate change. I suppose, as part of creating the Weekly Wood Business Park framework and recent ecology and nature conservation report, protecting weekly woodlands, examples were kind of highlighted. So I had a look at kind of the framework document that the SSR planning team provided in 2011. They said leisure was very key for the team to be able to do. Kind of the surrounding woodland and countryside to encourage informal recreation. To do so, we established a new setting where additional plants and waters can be provided. So I looked through that and kind of, the whole wood and sort of quarry areas there. And there's things like the hedgerows where, areas to be able to do walks would kind of cause challenges, and especially here where you look at kind of the hedges and sort of all the sort of species that might be affected. I was a bit concerned there. Why is that kind of what they're looking to do. Also, from having a look at his website homepage, two areas there, sort of cutting down, parts of the meadow, 6 warehouses. How does that really reconcile with the sort of corporate values in terms of their ESG sort of approach, which is very kind of common theme now with what kind of corporates are looking to do, and sort of especially, what we see in sort of private equity and sort of corporate finance. Also, when you look at the leisure and recreation space, they've sort of highlighted in that 2011 sort of vision statement for the park. For their people as well, how does that reconcile with a weekly Woods project, giving them space to be able to wander there. So that was another point. The impact. So I kind of feel, okay, as you pointed, there's no longer the plan to cut down sort of trees, but I kind of felt like from a personal perspective, walking in Weekley Woods and around that area, I do very frequently. So it's sort of a similar piece that, yes, it's not the sycamore gap, but it's very close to my heart to be able to walk around Weekley Woods, and it's sort of that similar impact of seeing a lot of our space being removed, that it had that similar sort of impact on me. So what that means in terms of community impact, which again was part of, our overall impacts on community and wildlife. It's a loss of a much loved green space, lots of personal memories from walking around, exploring the sort of quarries and area, the loss of wildlife and wildflowers, the approach to sustainability, environment, mental health, which I'll get on to in a moment, sort of, our community. 3 activities which were taken away from many of us. One of my favourite places for walking my dog, and taking away opportunities for our children and theirs. And it's just not going to stop if we lose that opportunity. I mean, with regards to the mental health benefits of visiting sort of UK Woodlands and surrounding areas, it's estimated to be 85 million. And bringing that all together, we have the mental health charity in mind. We have the Scottish Government Environment Minister kind of advocating for the mental health benefits of being able to walk around nature. And we have the Climate Change Minister of New Waters in Wales also kind of advocating for not losing our nature space, which I'm sure, the planning inspector will be well aware. I feel very strongly that with the urgent focus on climate change, conservation, ESG for mental and physical health, of being able to walk around, we can't see parts of the woods and its meadows permanently destroyed. We have already all of our statistics here, all the species that we need to save, the objections submitted, how many of us have signed this petition. And here are some of my own personal pictures taken, how important it is for us not to lose this space. I suppose a question I'd like to pose to you is, would you allow this to use nature where you live? I feel as well for me, I have a very serious medical condition. I have a brain tumour, I have epilepsy, I'm not able to drive. For me, being able to walk my dog, to be able to get out into nature where that mindfulness, my own mental health, is just incredibly important to me, because I don't cannot kind of be able to drive. I need to be able to get out into the where's my stop share? I need to be able to get out into the nature to just kind of help my seizures sort of reduce, because if I don't, it's just stuck in my every day of the week. Just to kind of calm a lot of the anxieties I feel. So I just feel very, very strongly. I mean, even from the piece of, the current company that's been granted permission there, I mean, Iron Kelly, it's providing sort of leather and sort of internal car sort of aerospace and rail sort of internal trims. I mean, how is that adding value really to our current environment? So I just feel like losing space within our small town, there's probably other places that these warehouses could be fulfilled. So I know I've spoken very quickly, but I'm conscious of your time. So do you have any further questions for me?
I certainly don't, Mr. Simon.
Thank you very much.
Would you be able to send a copy of that PowerPoint presentation to the case officer at the planning inspectorate?
Yeah, I'm disappointed she's not attended, given, you know, that she is the person that will be approving or denying the planning application. I mean, I feel that generally, I
Sure.
think that,
Let me disabuse you of that understanding.
I mean,
For my sins, I'm the person who will be making the decision. The case officer is a person who just provides me with administrative support and makes sure that I have all the papers. You're speaking to the organ grinder here.
Well, I suppose then, Sarah, I mean, great, I'm not able to attend on Wednesday because I couldn't drive to Folkestone with my medical condition. But I mean, how does this align for you with the government climate change, the Climate Act? You know, I mean, like, it feels just unaligned.
Can I stop you? Can I stop you there and say that I'm not here to answer questions like that. You will get an answer when my decision is issued.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I appreciate as well, we're all professionals, but from the person behind the impression, the person behind the professional, which I kind of, you know, in the kind of career that I'm in as well, it's kind of, I always think about how we're all here to kind of create a better world. But I just struggle to understand how kind of cutting down on nature and how kind of the circle of life occurs. There are certain projects in terms of how we can create a better world through kind of adding value there. But for this one, I can't seem to reconcile how really destroying our wildlife and nature, and kind of especially with the emphasis on ESG, climate change, and how kind of the real focus by our government on mental health, on how many of us are really needing that mindfulness. I just don't see how this project works, whereas I see how many other projects really make sense. But this one just doesn't really kind of settle well with me. So
you're not alone in making that point to the inquiry. So don't worry, it will be taken into account.
Yeah, I really appreciate that.
If you could send a copy of that to the case officer, I would be very grateful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'll let you get on. I also really appreciate you going out of your way to have a team call with me today. And you know, I just wasn't able to make Wednesday.
Don't worry.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Helen Skinner will be very impressed.
She's got some work to do.
Yes. Right. The Section 106 agreement. That's just, let me, got it here. I've read through it quite quickly before we started. Is it agreed now?
I'm told so, yes.
Yes, it
So,
is.
so it's picked up the particular points that you were concerned about, Mr. Fosdick, on behalf of the council in relation to the phase 2 site.
So far as my client wished to, yes.
Mr. Stinchcombe, do you have any comment?
No, so the comment I have got about making closing.
Well, on the basis of what I've read, there's nothing which strikes me as being untoward. Is there anything you want to say, Mr. Simons?
No, I suppose other than just timing.
Right, yes, well, that look, you know, it's unsigned.
Yes.
I'm happy to, rather than close the inquiry today, I'm happy to adjourn, give you time to complete the agreement and submit it. Have you got a timetable in mind?
The timetable I was going to suggest was 14 days.
Right.
Christmas morning or something.
I look forward to that.
You're settling down for your turkey. So yeah. So what?
It'll be the 22nd.
Let's see.
Yes, that's convenient to you, not inconvenient to you.
It's going to take me a while to work this one out.
Yeah.
So it's not going to cause any issues. So once that's received and in its completed form, all I will need is an electronic certified copy of the agreement, and then the case officer will close it in writing.
Yes.
Happy with that?
Yes, certainly. Yes,
And hopefully nothing will happen in the interim which causes a concern and have to revisit.
well, yes. Before. Yes, maybe that changes are afoot in national policy, but we'll jump off that bridge when we get to it.
Don't tempt fate.
Yeah.
Right, so before we move on to closings, is there anyone else who wishes to make representations? No? Mr. Stinchcombe.
So if I can ask my friend to pass the speech around, so I won't be using the microphone if that's okay, because it doesn't seem functioning. But if at any stage people can't hear me up in the gallery, if they could let you know so that I can raise my voice.
Someone's already raised their hand.
Have they? Oh dear. Let me see if I can make it work.
There was actually a thumbs up.
Oh, there we go, it's fine. Well, sir, as you will understand.
Will I need to call up the cases that you're going to refer to?
No, sir. There's a quote from one of them, and it'll be fairly straightforward. I don't think it's controversial. So, sir, as you'll understand, say Weekley Hall would dearly like the lowland meadow, which comprises a very considerable part of the appeal site, to remain as it is. But, as I stated in opening, they're realistic. And they're realistic enough to understand that since Policy 36 of the Joint Core Strategy allocates the appeal site for employment uses, some part of it is likely to be developed for those uses sometime in the future. Yet nonetheless, as I also explained in opening, they strongly object to this particular proposal. And they do so not despite Policy 36, but in large part precisely because of Policy 36 and the important constraints and requirements within that local plan allocation with which these appeal proposals manifestly fail to comply. So those constraints and requirements have all been deliberately included in site-specific Policy 36 for three important reasons. To promote the right type of jobs for this highly sensitive location, to protect that highly sensitive location from ad hoc and piecemeal development, and to protect it for very important environmental, ecological, amenity and landscape reasons. And yet in blatant breach of Policy 36, the appellant is simply ignoring those constraints and requirements, ones which have been deliberately included in an up-to-date and adopted local plan. So as you've heard, and I'll elaborate upon in these closing remarks, the appeal proposals offer the wrong type of jobs, contrary to the clear requirements of Policy 36. The appeal proposals have come forward without any master plan having been agreed with the local planning authority, again contrary to an express requirement of the Policy 36 allocation, and the consequence will be severe and unnecessary environmental, ecological, landscape and amenity harms, the very harms which Policy 36 is designed to minimise. So in what is meant to be a plan-led system, not a developer-led system, that's unacceptable. If and when the Policy 36 allocation is to be developed, that development must comply with, not undermine, the development plan. It must achieve the aspirations which underpin the allocation, and it must minimise the very harms which the allocation is specifically worded to address. So, furthermore, it's become apparent during the course of this inquiry that the appeal proposals have also come forward in fundamental breach of the mitigation hierarchy provided for by paragraph 180 of the National Planning Policy Framework. So that hierarchy requires, as a first step, the loss of the lowland meadow to be avoided, regardless of its condition, regardless of the policy 36 allocation. So it makes it absolutely clear that compensation, bespoke or otherwise, should only be considered as a last resort. And yet it's now quite clear from Mr. Goodwin's evidence on ecology and Mr. James' evidence on planning matters that that was not remotely the approach which has been taken by the appellant. So I'll return to the breach of the mitigation hierarchy a little later. Suffice it to say at this stage, however, that it is an independent reason for refusal, meaning that the appellant has to come back with a proposal that is not only compliant with the joint core strategy, but also protects priority habitat in the manner that national planning policy demands. So let me turn then, sir, to the appeal side and its surrounds and explain exactly why the location is so sensitive and why the ecological mitigation hierarchy ought to be applied. So as you've heard, the appeal site consists of approximately 23 hectares of grassland, with some woodland on its northern and eastern edges. It forms part of a wider area known as Weekley Wood, a good part of which was replanted by the then Duke in the 1950s and 1960s after being used for ironstone quarrying. So a newspaper article published in August 1963 quoted the Duke's explanation as to why that planting had taken place and what value should be attributed to it. It said this, or he said this: trees give pleasure to many by enhancing the beauty of the countryside. We believe that people of Kettering like to walk in the woods. We greatly appreciate the care they customarily show. It's hoped that all who visit the woods will enjoy doing so. If well cared for by us and visitors, it will in time become a wood of great beauty, of which not only our foresters, but the people of Kettering may be proud. So all of this great beauty, of which the people of Kettering are proud, is very proximate to the residential areas south of Weekley Wood Lane. It's readily accessible by bike and foot through public parks. It's also easy to visit by car, with parking on a lay-by close to public footpaths and in the nearby Holiday Inn car park. So it affords access not only to those who live locally, but further afield. Little wonder then that you've heard direct, personal testimony from very many local people, all of whom spoke movingly of both the joy and the relief afforded by the lowland meadow and its wooded surrounds. For many, sir, especially those living nearby, it's not just countryside on their doorstep, but highly valued countryside of a very rare quality. This is their refuge. It offers them both genuine pleasure and, for many, much needed respite. So Frances O'Dowd told you that she was hooked the very first time she ventured up to the wood. From then on, she went there with her dogs at least once a week whenever she could. She explained the joys of walking there in autumn, when the colours of the leaves are so strong and the deciduous trees stand out with their yellows and reds, when the hips, berries and sloes appear. She described the summer months also, when the flowers are out on the shrubs, attracting butterflies. She explained how much she enjoyed being away from the hustle and bustle of life, spending time in so natural an area so close to home. In her words, it was her place of thinking and be quiet. So Miss O'Dowd clearly spoke for many. Leaving aside the thousands who have signed the petition and the many third-party residents who participated in this inquiry, especially on Wednesday evening, in all the years Miss O'Dowd had been going there, she could not remember a single occasion when she failed to see at least one other person, even when visiting very early in the morning or very late in the evening. So by way of just some of the examples of the valued way in which the allocated site is widely used and enjoyed, Miss O'Dowd told you that the wood and meadow are great places for youngsters to play, to learn and have fun building dens, tree houses in the wood. She told us that scout and beaver groups regularly troop up to the meadow, then go to the wood to pitch camp and practice outdoor skills. that children from the local primary schools and forest schools use the wood and meadow for studying nature, for exercise, for map reading, for orienteering, for old-fashioned games. She told us that the wood and meadow are a paradise for people wanting to exercise, runners, joggers, cyclists, always to be seen, especially on Saturdays and Sundays, and often using the circular wood or more as a convenient track. She told us, and we've heard from them, that local running and cycling clubs use the area. It's an ideal place there for people and children to learn to ride fine. There are bird boxes in many of the trees. People are often seen quietly bird or bat watching. The Kettering Nature Road's bat spotting evening walks in the fringes of the meadow have been hugely oversubscribed. So you heard that on every Wednesday since April 2014, the local charity Groundwork North House has organised a wellbeing walk at Weekley Hallwood in the meadow. So that's an accessible walk for people of all ages and abilities that affords a safe way to explore and access the wood regardless of physical or mental difficulties. So my client itself organises regular family fun days, as Mr. Dale explained in detail, along with the numerous other activities he described. So put short, the wood and the meadow afford a beautiful and healthy environment for families to mix, for children to enjoy time outside, exercising, having fun and exploring nature. To local residents there, it is a country park in all but name. So as for the ecological value of the woodland meadow, we've heard the expert evidence of Ms. Bannon, the Conservation Officer for the Wildlife Trust. So for all of the reasons she gave, the appeal site is without doubt an ecologically sensitive location, and as I'll come on to, far more so than was previously acknowledged by either the appellant or the council. The appeal site lies between two sections of the Nen Valley Nature Improvement Area, and so 90% of it is comprised by 3 local wildlife sites. Weekley Hallwood Quarry LWS is a large woodland which contains areas of ancient woodland, woodland priority habitat, along with areas of plantation and touristically diverse access tracts. It was identified as an LWS in 1991 in recognition of those habitats, and a section of it is within the eastern edge of the appeal site. So the Cherry Hall Plantation LWS is along the western side of the appeal site, mostly beach with larch in places, and contains a variety of woodland flora. It was also identified as an LWS in 1991. And Weekley Wood Grassland LWS lies between the two woodland areas. So that is an area of grassland which is now agreed to be lowland meadow. It was designated as a grassland LWS in 2022. That's some 6 years after the Joint Core Strategy was adopted, and it was after the very high ecological value of the grassland was belatedly appreciated. So this grassland provides an important complementary habitat to the woodland habitat with which it's so intimately connected. And it's also valuable in its own right, being botanically interesting and containing a good number of neutral grassland species. So as Ms. Bannon explained, lowland meadows are in decline for both locally and nationally. So they're included as a habitat of principal importance in a list published by the Secretary of State under Section 41 of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act. So Mr. Goodwin, on behalf of the appellant, told us and confirmed that this grassland is of very high distinctiveness. So indeed, the Biodiversity Matrix 3.0 is not designed even to address its loss. It is oral evidence to the inquiry. Mr. Goodwin went on correctly to emphasise its importance. He told us, sir, lowland meadow is a good quality habitat. There's no getting away from it. It is a priority habitat, highly distinctive. Yes, he said, it's important. Much better quality than other neutral grassland. And that, of course, accords with the view expressed by Ms. Bannon in the same roundtable session. Grassland, sir, is the priority habitat, the star of the show. It is special. So as Ms. Bannon also explained, whilst the LWS identification For each of the woodlands and grassland is focused on their botanical importance, there are also valuable habitats for a range of other species, with verified records of wildlife seen in the area held by the Northamptonshire Biodiversity Records Centre. And further detail on all of that was of course given in the written and oral evidence of Mr. Riley. So with respect, as a result of the intensive local surveying which has been carried out over a number of years by both myself and other SWHW volunteers, you have the uncontested evidence of the highest probative value possible as to the extent to which the appeal site supports a myriad of species whose habitats are in need of protection. As Ms. Bannon explained in her rebuttal proof, that is evidence of far greater evidential value than the appellant's two Lockhart Garrett snapshot surveys in 2017 and 2022. And it is so for all the reasons I may turn to species by species. Start with the birds. So red-listed birds are those species with an increasing level of conservation concern. To be red-listed, the species must satisfy one of three criteria: being globally threatened, or having experienced a historical population decline, or having experienced at least a 50% decline in the UK breeding population over the last 25 years. So, given their obvious importance, Mr. Riley expressed his surprise that the Lockhart Garrett survey recorded only two red-listed species, linnets and mistletoe, when during the period of March 22 to April 23, he and his colleague Helen Wren had recorded a further four red-listed breeding species: grasshopper warbler, skylark, yellowhammer, and willow-tip, and three red-listed wintering birds: fieldfare, Westwood redpoll, and woodcock. Furthermore, sir, as Mr. Riley explained, the red-listed birds rely heavily on the appeal site for food and nesting. Grasshopper warbler and yellowhammer, for example, build their nests close to the ground, concealed in dense vegetation deep into brambles of sedge. The habitat in the appeal site is crucial to their survival, and the approval of the planning appeal would have a detrimental impact, especially given that the range of suitable habitats is decreasing at an alarming rate. So as for bats, the principal nature surveyors for my clients, Mr. Riley and Ms. Wren, both hold a certificate of bat acoustics analysis. They have, sir, the necessary expertise confidently to identify their recordings. So between them, they ensure that bat activity was consistently recorded during the appropriate time of dusk and for a duration of up to 2 hours after sunset. So that diligence is in stark contrast to the lackadaisical approach of Lockhart Garrett. As Mr. Riley explained, he has profound concerns with the positions of the two Lockhart Garrett static bat detectors, which would have recorded many more bat passes if one been placed along the hedgerow at the southern end of the appeal site, thereby being able to record the population commuting along this feature to forage in the appeal site, rather than after they had dispersed across the appeal site's expanse. So he also told you that Lockhart Garrett were wrong to assert that the thousands of bat calls recorded in July were likely recordings of the same bat, but staying within range of the detector for longer periods of time. Put simply, sir, it is impossible to determine whether this was a single bat using a static recorder, which is precisely why bat passes are recorded. So the bottom line is, for both of those reasons, my client's evidence is preferred to that of Lockhart Garrett on bats, and their evidence yields the following conclusions. First, the high number of passes recorded clearly demonstrates that the appeal site was an invaluable foraging location for the bat population in the nearby Brambleside estate and the wider area. And second, sir, the fact that several important species, soprano pipistrelle, barberstelle, and brown log-ear, were recorded strengthens the conclusion that Weekley Hall wood is an important roosting habitat for these protected species. So all of them are UK priority bat species listed by the Bat Conservation Trust, and barberstelle is not just rare, but near threatened, as Mr. Riley confirmed. So as for reptiles and amphibians, Mr. Riley explained that his placed refugium mats both throughout the appeal site and just outside the area to the north, and additionally conducted searches within a 250-metre buffer zone for water bodies that potentially host new populations. So those water bodies were indeed found, sightings recorded, including great crested newts. So little wonder then that Mr. Riley expressed his concern that the Lockhart Garrett surveyors failed even to identify any water bodies that could potentially host new populations, especially given that they claim to have been searching a 500-metre buffer zone. So whilst newts are all dependent on water bodies for breeding, they spend most of their lives foraging on land. Great crested newts can forage for as much as 500 metres from their breeding points. That means, sir, that the lowland meadow in the appeal site is a likely habitat in which the recorded newts will forage. So as for other wildlife, my client's biomaster spreadsheet, called document 842, also contains important information on additional wildlife. It includes numerous sightings of badgers, and Mr. Goodwin has confirmed that a set is present on the western side of the appeal site, that an outlier set is immediately to the south of this western set, and a further set to the north of the wider site. So historical records of moss have also been provided by Mark Hammond, the Northlands County recorder for moss, and certain numerous recordings of butterflies have been made, including nationally important species such as dingy skipper, grizzle skipper, smallheath, white admiral, and woodwine, all set out in Dr. Wagner's representation. So this evidence, this data, is incontrovertible. So it plainly shows that the Weekley woodland meadow are extremely important habitats for both floral and faunal populations. And yet, sir, as I now come on to, the appellant has conspicuously underestimated much of this, as indeed as the council. So although some of the errors I'm going to identify shortly have belatedly been acknowledged and partially corrected by Mr. Goodwin for the appellant, it is quite clear that the earlier ecological work done and conclusions reached by Lockhart Garrett in the environmental statement submitted in support of the appeal application was in certain regards deficient and in others simply wrong. So in particular, Mr. Goodwin agrees with Ms. Branham and the Wildlife Trust that the grassland is, in the Weekley woods, is lowland meadow. That's to say, a priority habitat under legislation. Lockhart Garrett, however, wrongly blame grassland to other neutral grassland in its 2022 surveys. So Mr. Goodwin also agrees that several of the surveys undertaken by Lockhart Garrett departed from best practice guidance, and Mr. Goodwin also agrees, unsurprisingly given the poor quality of the methodology, that the Lockhart Garrett surveys didn't capture all of the floral and faunal species within the study area. So far as the first of those matters is concerned, I've already touched upon the significance of the lowland meadow, but shortly its extra special importance and distinctiveness over and above Lockhart Garrett's erroneous belief that the appeal site only comprised other neutral grassland has been openly accepted by Mr. Goodwin at this inquiry. So as you've heard, he then goes on to assert that this means that bespoke compensation is necessary. However, sir, as I'll come on to a little later, that leaves out a vitally important step. In particular, the application of the mitigation hierarchy set out in paragraph 180 of the National Planning Policy Framework means that its loss should be avoided, regardless of the lowland meadows condition or the Policy 36 allocation, and before compensation, bespoke or otherwise, is even considered. So I'll come on to that a little later. So as for the second of the matters I've just covered, the failure I've mentioned, the failure to follow best practice guidance, Mr. Goodwin conceded that the Bat Conservation Trust requires surveys to be undertaken across 3 relevant seasons, but the Lockhart Garrett managed just June to October 2022, with static surveys from May to September. So far as breeding bird surveys are concerned, the Lockhart Garrett surveys were not undertaken in April, as best practice guidance recommends. And so far as the reptiles are concerned, concern. The surveys by Lockup Garrett allowed the refugia only 1 week to bed in rather than several weeks recommended by the best practice guidance. So as for the third matter, under recording, the consequential list and or under-recorded species that Mr. Goodwin conceded were as follows. They included the under-recording of bats for the reasons I've already given, the failure to record dingy and grizzled butterflies, both of which are listed as priority species in section 41 of the legislation, the failure to record at least 7 species of red-listed birds, and the failure even to identify any water bodies that could potentially host new populations, when both water bodies and great-crested, smooth and palmate newts are all present. So importantly, none of those errors, none of those omissions were known to the council when they made the policy 36 allocation. None of them were known to the local authority when they raised no objection to the appeal proposals on ecological grounds. The full picture, sir, is before you today only because of the efforts and the diligence of deeply concerned members of the public. So I then come on to the required approach to this appeal. In particular, sir, you'll know the starting point is section 38.6 of the 2004 Act and section 72 and 79.4 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. They require all applications and appeals to be determined in accordance with the development plan, properly interpreted, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So the most relevant parts of the development plan for our purposes are policy 22 of the JCS, delivering economic prosperity, policy 23, distribution of new jobs, policy 24, logistics, and most significantly of all, policy 36, land at Kettering North, the site-specific policy for this highly sensitive location. So as for the interpretation of those policies, that is a question of law. That was decided in Tesco Stores v Dundee. So it's to be determined objectively and in accordance with the language used, read in its proper context. The focus must therefore be on the words in the policy itself. That was confirmed by Lord Justice Richards in the Cherokee campaign case. And in that case, he also confirmed that the plan supportive text is an aid to the interpretation of policy, albeit it cannot trump policy. So it follows that there's either no room or very little room for recourse to external material as an aid to interpretation. So that was decided in the 5 days case and then confirmed in the J.J. Gallagher case, both of which make it clear that where a policy is neither obscure nor ambiguous, it's not appropriate to resort to other documents outside the local plan to help with the interpretation of policy. And so where a development plan has been adopted as sound, according to the words within that plan, a reader is entitled to rely upon an objective reading of those words without having to scour the extensive evidence base considered in the plan-making process, many of which documents will not be readily available, if available at all. So that was all made clear in the Fires Estates case at paragraph 56, and I've given you the quotation, I needn't read it out. So it's in light of all of that that site-specific policy falls to be interpreted and applied. However, so given that policy 36 is for employment uses, that's its allocation, it's necessary first to complete the scene setting by reference to 3 earlier joint core statutory policies in section 4 of that plan under the general heading delivering economic prosperity. That's policies 22, 23 and 24 that I've just mentioned. So far as policy 22 delivering economic prosperity is concerned, its supporting text is contained in paragraphs 8.1 to 8.10 of the joint core strategy. So paragraph 8.1 makes it clear that the development plan aims to achieve a sustainable balance between local jobs and workers and a more prosperous and diverse economy, including by ensuring that the right amount and type of employment land is available in locations that balance the demands of the market with the capacity of infrastructure and the need to protect and, where possible, enhance the environment. So paragraph 8.6 reiterates that aim, stating that a major part of the strategy for generating new and better jobs and creating a stronger and more sustainable economy will be the provision of the right amount and type of employment land in locations that balance the demands of the market with the need to protect, conserve, and where possible enhance environmental assets. And paragraph 8.7 identifies that to provide choice and flexibility in support of delivering of the right amount and type of employment in the right locations, the plan has identified a number of strategic employment sites. The policy 36 allocation is one of those, as are proposed strategic site 15 and committed site 11. So I've touched on the important differences between those strategic employment sites just a little later. So as far as policy 23 distribution of local jobs is concerned, that's supported by paragraphs 811 to 817 of the joint core strategy. So paragraph 815 tells us that to stimulate job growth and to ensure that enough land is identified to ensure balanced economic growth, the plan identifies a number of high quality strategic employment sites. And paragraph 816 goes on to state as follows in that regard. It's important to ensure that wherever possible, the scale and mix of these committed sites is brought forward in line with approved master plans to contribute towards the delivery of balanced employment across Northamptonshire. Proposals to change the mix of employment uses will need to satisfy the policies of the plan. So policy 24 logistics is supported by paragraphs 818 to 822 of the joint core strategy. So paragraph 818 tells us that a number of logistics sites are committed in Northamptonshire and identified as strategic employment sites on the key diagram. So importantly, those sites do not include the appeal site. Rather, they're proposed strategic site 15 on the key diagram to the south of junction 9 on the A14 and committed site 11 at junction 10 of the A14. And paragraph 821 of the joint core strategy goes on to identify that the benefits of accommodating logistics must be balanced against the visual, landscape and amenity impacts that Class B8 developments occasion. And so we know, sir, that that was the balancing exercise which led to proposed strategic site 15 and committed site 11 being allocated as logistics parks, policy 36 not doing so far as the appeal site is concerned. So I come on to policy 36 then, because it is in light of both the sensitivity of the allocated site and policies 22 to 24 that I've just taken you through, that the site-specific policy 36, the allocation applicable to these appeal proposals, expressly opens with the following words. Land at Kettering North, as shown on the policies map, is allocated primarily for employment uses. The site will provide for a minimum 40 hectares of B1 business, B2 general industry, and small-scale B8 storage and distribution development, together with approximately 3 hectares of leisure. A comprehensive master plan to be agreed by the local planning authority should make provision for the above requirements and include proposals for and they're covered in subparagraphs 8 to 1. So looking at those open words, reading them objectively and in context as we're required to do as a matter of law, it is quite obvious that policy 36 seeks the development of the allocation site primarily of high quality B1 and B2 employment with only small scale class B8 development missing. And it's quite obvious also that such development is to be secured only after a comprehensive master plan has been agreed by the local planning authority. That's what the policy says. All of that, sir, is totally unambiguous. In particular, sir, so far as the first point is concerned, there is no reason to reach for a dictionary or any of the extraneous documents upon which the appellant relies to understand the meaning of small scale. Any recourse or retreat to those extraneous documents as later interpretation would be a straightforward error of law. So these are very ordinary words. Small scale means small scale. And the question as to whether any given proposal, these appeal proposals or any other, complies is simply a matter of judgment for the decision maker, looking at the size of any individual warehouse buildings proposed, the proportions of built floor space dedicated to Class B warehouse use rather than Class B1 or Class B2 uses, and the total quantum of Class B8 warehouse floor space that is proposed. So furthermore, so far as the second point is concerned, the matters which are required to be provided for through the agreed master plan are set out in subparagraphs 8I of Policy 36. So they include an integrated transport network focused on walking and cycling, and providing permeable and safe routes to connect Kettering North to the town centre, areas to the south of Weekley, Wood Lane, and the countryside. And so it also includes the, related to that, the extension of the Kettering Business Park circular. So those matters include also the provision of a network of high quality landscaping and green infrastructure, one which integrates the development into the wider countryside and retains and where possible enhances the historic landscape and the ecological and recreational value of the site. It includes the protection of the local wildlife sites from potential damage through drainage and runoff, and it includes the delivery of infrastructure through the implementation of the agreed master plan. So as Mr. Crook explained, and Mr. James agreed, the supporting text of Policy 36 identifies the site-specific characteristics which underpin those development plan requirements. It's high quality woodlands, the need to deliver improved walking and cycling connections with the existing urban areas and existing bridleways, a network of walking, cycling and equestrian infrastructure within the development, connected network of green infrastructure, which enhances biodiversity assets, recreational opportunities and links to the surrounding area. The consequential requirement for a high quality landscape treatment to assimilate the development into the countryside, create a high quality environment, mitigate the impact on heritage assets, enhance the setting of Brighton House and House Registered Parking Garden. The fact that Weekley Wood Lane forms a significant barrier for pedestrians and cyclists, whilst the woodland to the south of the lane further separates the site from Kettering. The need to enhance the safety and quality of links through the woodland to the residential area beyond, to identify further opportunities to enhance connectivity towards the town centre. The fact that much of the woodland on the side and directly to the north is designated as an LWS and forms an important feature in the landscape. The fact that park has also been identified as a potential wildlife site. The entreaty that the woodland setting of the sites provide inspiration for the development of contemporary and innovative buildings. The fact that there are dwellings adjacent to the southwest corner of the site and that the amenity of residents will therefore need to be protected in accordance with Policy A. So, notably, Policy 36, as worded and adopted, including its requirements, constraints and supporting text, plainly accords with the manner in which the appellant promoted the allocation in the plan-making process in the first place. That is to say, as a site which is only suitable for a campus-style development with only small-scale Class B8 warehouse. And you've seen that in the framework document, the Weekley Wood Business Park. So that was understood. That need was understood even before the ecological importance of the lowland meadow was fully understood, if it was understood at all. So it's in light of all of that that it's quite plain that Mr. James is simply wrong when he asserted that there's no issue over the principle of development and the focus of this inquiry should only be on the process for delivery. He was wrong when he asserted that Policy 36 is a permissive policy which was not prescriptive in terms of the division of the quantum of uses referenced to be delivered, and he was wrong when he asserted that Policy 36 of the strategy leaves open the question of how its objectives should be delivered and merely states that such provisions should be made through an agreed master plan without specifying how or when an agreement should be reached. So not one of those propositions is correct, and not the least because, as I may come on to, Policy 36 is most certainly prescriptive as to both the division of the quantum of uses to be delivered and the means by which they're to be delivered. That is to say, after prior approval of a master plan. So both of those requirements are ones which these proposals simply fail to comply with. So as for the former, the division of the quantum of uses, we've seen that the opening words of the policy state that the site will provide for a minimum of 40 hectares of B1 business and B2 general industry, and will provide for only small-scale Class B8 development. So the mandatory word will is prescriptive, and it prescribes that there should be a minimum of 40 hectares of Class B1 and Class B2, and that there should be only small-scale Class B8. So at risk of repeating myself, there is no ambiguity in that wording. Very objectively in accordance with the language used in its proper context, whether by the man on a Kettering omnibus, whether by a resident on the Brambleside estate, whether by the Duke of Weekley, or whether by any reasonable planning consortium, it is quite obvious that this is an allocation which seeks predominantly Class B1 and Class B2 development, with Class B8 development of a considerably lesser scale. There's no need for any recourse to any extrinsic documentation to understand that. Indeed, such recourse is impermissible as a matter of law. And yet, the only development before this inquiry is for 22,490 metres squared. That's to say 68% of the proposed development, Class B8 warehouses, just 10,674 square metres, 32% of Class B2 development, and absolutely no Class B1 development at all. So that is a distribution of uses, which in both quantitative and proportionate terms is quite obviously the inverse of that which policy 36 requires. So, and as I come on to just a little later, that inversion has profound consequences in terms of both the impact of the proposals on the environment and the type and number of jobs which will be generated. So in both regards, the outcome is in conflict with the aspirations and the requirements of policy 36. And so these conflicts are in considerable part a result of the appellant's erroneous view, expressed by both Mr. James and by Mr. Bolton, that the words small scale, Class B8 storage and distribution development embrace any Class B8 warehouse buildings of less than 100,000 square feet or 9,300 square metres. So that interpretation of policy is simply wrong for all the reasons I may come on to. As a matter of law, sir, policy 36 is primarily to be determined and construed in accordance with the words actually used in the policy. That's a small scale. So there is no reference whatsoever to the figure of 9,300 square metres in policy 36. It's simply not there. So furthermore, insofar as that figure is referenced in the points of core strategy at all, that's only in paragraphs 819 to 820 of the support for the logistics policy, policy 24. But that figure is then explained in the inset box arrowed into paragraph 820. And that tells us that 9,300 metres squared is the floor space figure above which a unit would, of itself, an individual unit, be a large unit, strategic distribution warehouse. So it is obviously absurd to suggest that a warehouse qualifies as being small scale simply because it's marginally smaller than a large strategic distribution warehouse. And that was especially the case when the insert box itself identifies a range of unit size below that threshold, specifically rising from small units at 929 square metres to medium up to 4,650 square metres and mid-box up to 9,400 square metres. So not even the appellant took the position that Mr. Bolton and Mr. James now take at this inquiry, when in its 2011 business framework document, the term small scale was expressly suggested in the appellant's own words as meaning less than 50,000 square feet. That's 4,650 square metres. That's to say half the figure for which the appellant is now arguing, embracing only individual units identified as small or medium in the inset box of the joint core strategy. And even more notably, the council rejected the appellant's suggested threshold for small scale when adopting the JCS, giving no figure at all in policy 36, and specifically identifying small units as being only those below 929 square metres in the inset box. And so the true absurdity of the appellant's interpretation of policy 36 in all these regards was exposed, we suggest, by the oral evidence of Mr. Bolton at the inquiry, he would have you believe that the word small-scale B8 storage and distribution development actually means small-scale storage and distribution units, thereby rewriting the policy impermissibly in the first place. Have you believe that the words small-scale storage and distribution units embrace any storage unit which is smaller, perhaps by just 1 square metres, than the size of a large unit strategic distribution warehouse, which must be wrong for all the reasons I've just given. And he also suggested that it would be compliant with policy 36 to build only Class B8 warehouses, not a mix with Class B1 and B2 at all, and as many individual Class B8 warehouses as could be squeezed onto the appeal site in between the tarmac service areas, provided all of them are marginally smaller than a large unit strategic distribution warehouse. So he suggested that even when policy 36 clearly mandates that there will be a minimum of 40 hectares B1 and B2 development and only small scale B8. So his interpretation cannot possibly be correct. It is obviously wrong. So policy 36 is to be construed according to the very ordinary words actually used. Small scale means small scale. The question as to whether any given proposal complies is a matter for the judgment of the decision maker, looking only at the size of the individual warehouse buildings, proportions of the built space dedicated to the various uses, and the quantum of Class B8 or warehouse space actually proposed. So, and in those regards, please note therefore that the extent and development here of the here proposed, that's to say 6 big sheds in the telling terminology of Mr. Goodwin, with a gross internal space of 33,166 square metres, is constituted as follows. One big shed will be the single Class B2 building, 10,675 square metres in size, and the remaining 22,000 plus square metres of built development will all be in Class B8 use and dispersed over 5 big shed warehouses. As to the size of the proposed unit, 2 will be considerably bigger than the 4,650 metre threshold, which was the upper limit of small-scale warehouse development asserted by the appellant when advocating a landscape campus-style development through the local plan examination. That's to say 7,600 metres and 5,400 square metres respectively. On top of those 2 huge units, a third will just be just below that upper limit suggested by the appellant when promoting the local allocation of local plan, and about 4.5 times larger than a small unit as identified in the JCS, and the remaining 2 warehouses proposed will each be about 3 times the size of a single small unit as identified in the JCS. As most tellingly of all perhaps, the total quantum of Class B8 development proposed, 22,491 square metres, will be 2.4 times the floor space of a large unit strategic distribution warehouse. 2.5 times nearly larger than a large strategic warehouse. And pretty much the rest of the lower meadow, including its most ecologically valuable parts, sacrificed to the straight roads and extensive tarmac needed to accommodate the HGVs serving on this park, with hardly any room for internal landscaping to soften the blow. So whichever way one looks at it, whether by reference to the size of the individual units, the proportionate dispersal of the land uses proposed, or the totality of Class B8 development proposed, that is not remotely what policy 36 properly interpreted seeks when mandating that on small scale Class B8 storage and distribution development is permissible. So furthermore, as I've already alluded to, that departure from policy has profound ramifications, both on the ground in the real world. It does in terms of both the impact of the proposals on the environment and the type and number of jobs to be generated. So I'll return to the nature and extent of the consequential impacts of this overdevelopment on the environment, that's to say amenity, landscape, ecology, and habitats a little later. But suffice it to say at this stage that paragraph 8.1 of the Joint Core Strategy makes it clear that through the allocations which it makes, the strategy aims to deliver employment development in locations that balance the demands of the market with the need to protect and where possible enhance the environment. The paragraph 8.21 of this Joint Core Strategy specifically states that when identifying these locations and the uses to which they're put, the benefits of accommodating logistics have to be balanced against the visual, landscape and amenity impacts council were plainly seeking to build form which was protective of the sensitive environment in which it would be located for important visual, landscape and amenity reasons, not to mention ecological, and so that judged against the sensitivities of the allocated site, the appellant is proposing to erect quite simply too many buildings, including far too many warehouses, and most of those buildings, not just warehouses, are unacceptably large. So as for the second of the matters I mentioned, the type and number of jobs which will be generated by the proposals, so we see that policy 8.1 of the joint force strategy also makes it clear that the strategy aims to deliver the right amount and type of employment for the various locations identified. So in this case, and for all the reasons I've given, the jobs that they were seeking here was plainly a preponderance of higher quality, higher paid, non-warehouse jobs. So in these regards, however, as Mr. Cook's rebuttal to amply demonstrated, it's quite evident that the employment generated by a more policy compliant application to the appeal side in terms of the prescribed division of the uses would be very considerable, considerably greater than is currently proposed, and that the preponderance of those jobs would be higher quality and higher paid, thereby generating greater economic benefit than the Class B jobs anticipated from the appeal proposal. So I've mentioned in the footnote, the only high quality Class B jobs identified in the joint force strategy are managerial ones. So those fundamental flaws are exacerbated, moreover, by the piecemeal way in which the appellant has proposed to bring forward this development, that's to say, as a logistics park, in the very candid words of Ms. Brockett at the inquiry on day 3, ahead of any other proposal for the remainder of the policy 36 allocation. So in particular, whilst Mr. James might claim that the appeal proposal should not be considered as a standalone development, but as the first phase of a comprehensive development, that's simply not how the planning system works, as Mr. Cook explained. So there is just one proposal to be determined. That single proposal has to be considered on its own merits. That proposal is the one I've described. The 5 warehouses with a total floor space of 22,491 square metres, and just one Class B unit, B2 unit, with a floor space of 10,000 plus square metres. So no other development is before us. No planning application for the remainder of the allocated sites has been made. Any suggestions as to what, if anything, might in the future be proposed for that land is entirely speculative. There is, quite simply, absolutely no guarantee that anything will be proposed for that land in the future. Still less it will contain anything remotely like that suggested in the appellant's design development brief. It may be that the land never comes forward for development at all, or only comes forward in the proportions currently proposed. We get another split of predominantly warehousing as against other uses. As Mr. James correctly acknowledges, you cannot agree the design development brief in this appeal, in supposed compliance with policy 36 master planning requirement. That's because it relates to land entirely outside of the appeal site area. If this appeal is allowed, therefore, planning permission will not be granted for the first phase of a comprehensive development in Mr. James's word, will be granted only for a Class B8 logistics park with 5 warehouses and just one Class B2 building. That's all that can be permitted. And as Mr. James further correctly acknowledges, indeed he asserts, the council retains control to refuse development on the remainder of the allocated land should a subsequent proposal be for yet more warehousing. But in that they will also assert, all that will have been permitted if this appeal proposal were to succeed would be a standalone development, predominantly Class B8 warehousing, and that is not compliant with policy 36. So for all of those reasons, these appeal proposals are in fundamental breach of policy 36 in terms of the division of the quantum of uses proposed. So I now come on to the other fundamental breach of policy 36. That's to say the process by which it seeks to deliver development on the allocated site. So I've already noted that Mr. James asserts that policy 36 merely states that provision should be made to an agreed master plan, but without specifying how or when agreement should be reached. And the answer is that means there's no policy requirement for agreement of the master plan by the local planning authority prior to submission of any planning application. So that is plainly incorrect. Policy 36 tells us that a comprehensive master plan to be agreed by the local planning authority should make provision for all the requirements I've identified. So So that requirement to agree a master plan has to be read in the light of policy 816 of the JCS, which states that wherever possible, it's important that proposals comply with approved master plans. So proposals can only comply with an approved master plan if that master plan has already been approved. It's quite obvious, therefore, that a comprehensive master plan is to be agreed by the local planning authority under policy 36 in advance of development being permissible. That master plan should make provision for all of the specified matters specified, that is to say, in policy 36, and that any proposed development should accord with that agreed master plan. No master plan has been agreed. And as Mr. James correctly accepted, you're not in a position to agree any master plan as a part of these proposals or at this inquiry. It's a breach of policy. So whilst Mr. James argues that the sole purpose of a master plan requirement is to ensure that any development now doesn't prejudice the development of the remainder of the allocated site in the future, that's also wrong. You could actually concede this, but again, is all evidence. That's not the sole purpose of the policy 36 requirement for a master plan to be agreed, not even its dominant purpose, and especially when no master plan has been agreed as required, so that we have no idea as to what the development's not to be prejudiced. So the principal purpose of the requirement to agree a master plan in advance is to ensure delivery of a policy compliant development, one which secures all the matters specified in policy 36, not the least of which is the compliant balance of business uses, and that compliant balance of business use to be alongside a network of high quality green infrastructure, one which retains and enhances the ecological and recreational value of the site, alongside an integrated transport network focused on walking and cycling, and alongside the infrastructure upon which the totality of the development will depend. So the current application to a piecemeal development of just one part of the site cannot achieve any of that. No mechanism exists to secure the delivery of any element of phase 2, as the appellant would call it. The current mechanism proposed amply demonstrates that. So under that mechanism, that's in Schedule 1, Covenants 2.1 to 2.4 of the Process 106 agreement, the appellant can build the first 4 units without even submitting any application for his or its phase 2. It could build the next 2 units upon the submission of any planning application for phase 2, however hopeless that application might be, and it can occupy all 6 units, even if phase 2 is refused or if it's permitted is never built. So that means, for example, that if these appeal proposals are approved, there's nothing you can do to prevent Kettering from ending up with a standalone warehouse park on the remotest part of the allocated site with no permeable and or safe routes connecting Kettering north to the areas of south of Weekley Wood Lane, and no extension of the Kettering Business Park circular walk either. So that breaches policy 36 directly. So alongside all of those breaches of policy 36, the mitigation hierarchy provided for by paragraph 180A of the framework, national policy framework, is also breached. So as Ms. Bannon explained, the Weekley Wood Grassland LWS would be almost entirely lost should the appeal proposal go ahead, and with it, the botanical interest of the area. But, the first stage of the mitigation hierarchy is to avoid the loss of existing biodiversity assets. So as I've already referred to, Mr. Goodwin missed that out entirely when lurching straight to an argument that bespoke compensation was necessary. So that's a fundamental error in approach. And that became readily apparent when Mr. Goodwin explained his approach orally at the inquiry. So he made it absolutely clear that whilst he would much prefer to avoid the loss of the grassland rather than compensate for it, and that's because he said it's probably habitat on an LWS, he considered that the loss of the habitat was inevitable because the site was allocated for this kind of development, because that development had to be located on the lowland meadow, because of heritage and woodland constraints prevented moving the big sheds elsewhere to the east, and because of the construction requirements in terms of land take for big shelf buildings. Hence, he said, it necessarily entailed the entire loss of the lowland meadow LWS. So that approach is entirely wrong. It's entirely wrong for three reasons. Firstly, Mr. Goodwin's premise is false. Indeed, it's the very epitome of developer-led planning when ours is a plan-led system. Policy 36 does not support, let alone compel, the development of big shade warehouses at all, still less finding them. The assumption one simply has to accommodate that appeal proposal on the appeal site, despite the entire loss of the lowland meadow LWS, manifestly puts the cart before the horse, and especially so in light of the following matters set out clearly in the joint core strategy. The acknowledged adverse impacts of Class B development identified in paragraph 821 of the joint core strategy. The resultant allocations of proposed strategic site 14 and committee site 14, street sites 11 and 14 for strategic warehouses. That's Lane Junctions 10 and 11 on the A14. The starkly different allocations of the policy 36 site for small scale Class B development only, and the requirement identified in policy 36 that any development pursuant to that allocation must deliver green infrastructure which integrates the development into the countryside and maintains and enhances where possible the ecological and recreational values. That's the first reason he's wrong. The second reason he's wrong is this. The protection afforded to the woodland LWSs applies to the lowland meadow also, given partial status. And just as required with the woodland, one therefore needs to avoid the loss of that lowland meadow habitat wherever possible, looking to compensation only as a last resort. So you just mentioned the lady who you joined us on team, that they had indeed saved the woodland. They have to save as far as possible the meadow too. And so third, given that the allocation is much larger than the appeal site, there is ample scope to consider how much lowland meadow could be retained, simply by looking at the type and scale of the development proposed, where it's to be located, and the detail of its design and layout. So to respond to Mr. James directly, that is not to advocate a binary choice. It's not to advocate a binary choice of no development at all, as opposed to the appeal proposals. Quite to the contrary, so it's simply to advocate the application of the mitigation hierarchy so as to avoid the loss of as much of the lowland meadow as possible, whilst also developing a policy-compliant business park in accordance with Policy 36. That is entirely possible, but it's only possible for a different proposal, one comprised by small-scale Class B warehouses only, not 5 big warehouse sheds on a lowland meadow with the attendant loss of so much broken habitat. However, the appellant didn't look at that at all. It entirely missed out that fundamental exercise. It wrongly considered that the proposed development was somehow mandated by Policy 36 and had to be located somewhere on the allocated site. That is a fundamental breach of the mitigation hierarchy which has to be applied, and it has to be applied in order to prevent the unnecessary loss of a declining priority habitat of very high distinctness. So, of itself, that compels refusal of concurrent proposals so that the appellant is forced back to the drawing board. So it's in light of these serious breaches of both Policy 36 of the Joint Core Strategy and of the mitigation hierarchy required by paragraph 180 of the National Planning Policy Framework that the impacts of the standalone development currently before you ought to be considered. So it's to those impacts on the ground I now turn. I start with amenity, visual and landscape impacts. So Ms. O'Dowd voiced the concerns of many when she explained her devastation at the prospect of the appeal proposals going ahead as presently proposed in her words. The buildings, the car parks, the HGV parking areas, the service roads are going to swamp the area. There'll be no space to plus vast warehouses and black tarmac. The development will, for very many, kill any enjoyment of the space presently provided by the meadow. So as she stated, warehouses with 16-metre elevations will dwarf the trees in the woodland. It will leave people feeling like they're walking around the edge of an industrial site, not enjoying a lovely open space at all. But when the lowland meadow is a key liminal space which gives the woodland its context. By losing the meadow, she said, the context of woodland will be entirely different prospect, walking between woods and warehouses as compared to walking between woods and a meadow. Having those warehouses right next to the woodland house will impact on the views and light for all visitors. There will be increased noise, air pollution, lorries driving in and out of the current meadow night and day. A peaceful and clean space is transport and natural environment will be sought forever, she said. She was right. Mr. Down's sentiments were entirely echoed by Mr. Shaw. He stated the proposed development will have a very significant impact visually and a huge detrimental effect on the natural character of the area. And I set out a quote, a telling quote from his written evidence in paragraph 87 of my closing. So none of that is even controversial. All of those visual, landscape and energy impacts were readily and fairly conceded by Ms. Brockhurst and cross-examination on day 3. And as Ms. Brockhurst also readily conceded, they're all harms which in landscaping terms, guided by Bolivia 3, are to receptors of high sensitivity. But like Mr. Goodwin, Ms. Brockhurst's argument was that these harms in landscape, visual and amenity terms were the inevitable and unavoidable consequence of the policy 36 allocation and the operational and functional requirements, including access by HGVs, of building in her words a logistics park, and the need to avoid the loss of woodland. But for the reasons I give in respect to the approach of Mr. Goodwin, Ms. Brockhurst's approach is also fundamentally wrong. Rather than assume that a landscaping scheme had to accommodate the appeal proposals, Ms. Brockhurst needed to ask herself whether the appeal proposals were acceptable in the first place, given the policy 36 requirements that any development must be inspired by the policy setting and integrated into it. She failed to do any of that. Like Mr. Goodwin, she simply put the cart before the horse. They both kept the very question they needed to address, that's to say the acceptability or otherwise of the appeal proposals in the first place. So finally, whilst Ms. Brockhurst took the view that these policy 36 requirements were reflected in the illustrative phase 2 drawings, she also conceded that the standalone appeal proposals actually before us are very far removed from the landscape campus style development depicted in those drawings. So that speaks volumes, given that we only have the logistics park in our own words before us. Those illustrative drawings serve only to make it clear quite how deficient, quite how harmful, quite how non-compliant with policy 36 these appeal proposals are. Come then to the ecological impact. So as Ms. Bannon correctly pointed out, on top of the matters I've already considered, there will be ecological impacts to the significant quality of the adjacent woodland also, through rise and runoff, as a consequence of which there's a need carefully to design the transition from and to the woodland. That's an additional point which you have to take into account. However, as she readily stated, the real problem is the grassland LWS. So as I've already submitted, the Weekley Wood grassland LWS would be almost entirely lost as a result of these proposals, and with it the botanical interest of the area. When the first stage of the mitigation hierarchy is to avoid the loss of existing biodiversity as at all possible, that has simply been ignored. And even repeat my suspicions on that. Furthermore, however, and as Ms. Bannon also explained, both in a rebuttal and orally, to the extent that bespoke compensation is to be relied upon at all, there are profound concerns of what's currently proposed. Whilst Mr. Goodwin argues that the existing compensation proposal is still adequate as a bespoke compensation package for the more valued grassland than was previously understood, the majority of the 5 grassland creation sites are isolated from each other and from other habitats. That's not suitable compensation for the larger block of grassland which is almost surrounded by woodland. Further so, whilst Mr. Goodwin stated that proposed grassland offset sites were linked by hedgerows and scrub, we don't know anything about their condition, about their value to wildlife, or how or if they would be retained and managed for the lifetime of the bespoke compensation package. It's entirely uncertain as to whether the compensation parcels are linked or will continue to be linked. And moreover, as Ms. Bannon also explained, the biodiversity metric applies risk multipliers to habitat creation to account for uncertainties in their creation, and it's high for a lowland meadow because it's not straightforward to create. So success is dependent on the fertility of the soil and on ongoing management. And given that the areas identified for creation are arable, it's likely that total soil fertility would make the creation of lowland meadow challenging. To be satisfied, sir, that it would be possible to achieve with the tool, store fertility information required, management techniques need to be known to lower the fertility if needed. So that information is needed now. As Ms. Barron explained, it's simply insufficient wishfully to hope for reassurance further down the line when it will be too late to do anything if hopes are dashed. And yet, so you have no details of any of that at all. So finally, on ecology, with the loss of the grassland also comes the loss of a range of wildlife, birds, butterflies, reptiles, bats, those which have already been recorded there, many of which are already suffering decline. So if the proposed development goes ahead, there will inevitably be a negative impact on their survival due to the loss of habitat, due to the loss of foraging areas, due to the artificial light at night, and due to all other disturbances. So as for impacts of sustainable transport, we've heard from Ms. Holland, a professional travel planner with considerable experience of promoting active and sustainable travel. So as she explained, the appeal proposals do not include adequate measures to enable or encourage a suitable increase in sustainable travel modes, such as walking, cycling, scooting, public transport. There are three, so we suggest takeaway points from Holland's evidence. So first, the appeal proposals are now out of date in that they fail to follow cycle infrastructure design LTN 120. That's because they propose shared use paths rather than segregating cycling pedestrians. When paragraph 6534 of that national policy guidance makes it quite clear that that should be proposed only as a last resort. We're very far from being a last resort territory, sir, given the scale of the land available to accommodate segregation. So second, the appeal proposals lack any of the ambition necessary to deliver the modal shift required, with many opportunities missed, such as time passenger information on properly equipped and financed long-term bus shelters. And third, sir, against the backdrop of non-compliance with other travel plans, which Mr. Shepherd also bears responsibility, you've seen no evidence as to how the travel plans can be enforced should an occupier fail to comply. The appellants have not offered any evidence of either stick or carrot to make the travel plan work. As for sticks, you have no information at all as to how any breach of any tenancy agreement might be addressed. No lease has been served, and certainly no suggestion made of termination in the circumstances. And as for carrots, neither has any bond been offered to incentivise compliance. So as for benefits, the other side of the planning balance, Mr. Hook conceded there will clearly be some economic benefits from the proposed development. However, sir, those are not the economic benefits of the type or scale which the Joint Core Strategy deliberately and carefully sought from this particular site, where the focus has always been on higher quality jobs in a landscape setting, meeting the needs of a balanced local economy whilst respecting the values featured in the sign. So what's actually proposed is Class B jobs in bulky and bland warehouses. So the benefits to which Policy 36 aspires can be secured, but only through a comprehensive, predominantly Class B1 and B2 development, one which accords with Policy 36 and comes forward pursuant to an agreed master plan under that policy. As Mr. Harvey agreed in these regards, Class B1 and Class B development is needed. So there is simply no justification for abandoning the requirements of Policy 36 simply to allow the appellant to cram in oversized, big shed warehouses at the expense of both priority habitats and residential amenity. So I come then to the planning balance and the conclusion. So you've seen that statute requires this appeal proposal to be determined in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So for all the reasons I've given, Policy 36 of the development plan is fundamentally breached, as indeed is the mitigation hierarchy of vitally important material consideration. The consequence is significant harm to amenity, to landscape, and ecology, but without securing benefits which Policy 36 requires to be delivered. The planning balance, therefore, is firmly weighed in favour of the development plan. Quite simply, there are insufficient material considerations to justify development in blatant breach of Policy 36 and paragraph 180 of the framework. And so, sir, to answer the conundrum which you expressed in your question to Mr. O'Dowd and Mr. Dell when they gave their evidence, the answer is as follows. The appeal must be dismissed so that the appellant can come forward with a comprehensive development plan which makes provision for all of the master plan, which makes provision for all of the Policy 36 requirements. If and when that master plan is agreed, the appellant must come forward with a comprehensive proposal for the whole policy 36 allocation, and in doing so, sir, the appellant must avoid the loss of as much forestry habitat as possible, including not just the woodland, but the lowland meadow as well. So that is what both policy 36 and the mitigation hierarchy demand. Our plan-led system policy 36 must prevail, for so long as it remains part of the adopted and up-to-date development plan, and especially when seen alongside paragraph 180 of the National Framework, and the importance to be attributed to the protection of declining forestry habitat. I therefore, sir, respectfully invite you to dismiss this appeal. So that we're going to be forced back to the drawing board to do an awful lot better than it's done thus far, and fully explore the options for a landscape countryside development which respects and integrates with the surrounding countryside, which delivers the environmental protection which both statute and policy demand. So those options have not yet been explored. They must be explored before this priority habitat is lost forever. So let's go a couple further. Those are proposed submissions of my plan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Finch. Want to continue or I'll agree?
I'm very happy. I don't know what Mr. Simon's timings are and whether we're aiming for.
Well, probably if we were to do the next one, well, the thing is because I've not been able to print mine yet, because I'm not going to finalise it pending Mr. Fallsby. So
well, then
maybe the next one and then have a bit of a printing break. That would be great. And get that suited.
Could we just have 2 minutes now?
No, sure.
Thank you very much, sir. I think we've got a hard copy and it's going to be put on the website as well. Can I just show you the structure of the speech? It's going to take me about an hour, a bit less than an hour, I think. First of all, the introduction and overview. And at page 2, I get into the interpretation and application of policy under various headings. It takes you through to page 11, where I look at the implications of the correct understanding of what the policy means in section C. Section D, I look at landscape. E on page 16, other requirements of policy 36. Then I pull it all together in development plan compliance on page 17, and then look at need from page 19, and the planning balance and the conclusions from 21. So that's the overall structure. This proposal, and please bear with me with my voice, I might have to be eating lozenges a little bit to keep it going, but this proposal is essentially for a logistics park when the words small-scale BA development in the allocation mean that that is expressly and specifically not what the land is allocated for. On a proper understanding of P36, it's allocated for essentially B1, B2 development to provide choice and flexibility to meet B1, B2 needs. It's a key component of the vision of the JCS to rebalance the economy and providing high quality jobs by providing a high quality B1, B2 environment here. The proposal is 22,000 square metres or 70% of the total GIA for B8 on a 22 hectare site. It's indisputably not small scale B8 development when that phrase is properly understood, and is thus a clear breach of the policy for this site, as we shall show of the development plan as a whole. On a correct understanding of P36, the appellant thus has to rely on a need case. But the site was allocated to meet a different need, which on the appellant's own evidence persists. This proposal would prevent that need from which the site was allocated in the first place being met, crowding it out as more lucrative B8 usurps it. And third, the proposal is not just contrary to the allocation, but actively prevents the allocation from allocating that for which the land was allocated and which it should still meet. The cramped nature of the site and the consequential landscape harm is on the appellant's evidence a function of the provision of the logistics park. Its provision prevents the provision of what the policy requires, a well-landscaped, high-quality B1, B2 environment. The application is standalone and is to be assessed as such. It does not provide the required integration with Kettering via Weekley Wood Lane and is physically and visually divorced from the urban settlement edge on Weekley Wood Lane, of which the allocation is meant to be an extension. The proposal is thus the opposite of what the allocation envisages in almost every respect. The development is not in accordance with Policy 36 or the development plan as a whole, and on a correct understanding, the planning balance is decisively against any grant of permission. In terms of the fundamental question in this case, which is the interpretation and application of Policy 36, as you will know, sir, there's a clear distinction between the interpretation of policy and the subsequent application of policy in accordance with the correct interpretation. The former is a matter of law, the latter is a matter of judgment. The two exercises must not be confused. And of course here there is a fundamental difference between the parties as the interpretations of the first stage of the exercise, the interpretation of P36, not just as to its application on the facts. I then turn to the legal principles of interpretation. The correct interpretation is the essential starting point for consideration of this appeal and compliance of these proposals with the development plan and section 38.6. The interpretation of policy in a local plan is a matter of law. Policies should be interpreted objectively in accordance with the language used, read in its proper context. What policy means is not a matter for evidence or cross-examination or a matter of expert judgment. It is for the court to determine the true practical meaning of the words used and to look for an interpretation that is straightforward without undue or elaborate exposition. Forensic archaeology and excessive legalism must be avoided. Specifically, interpreting policy by reference to extrinsic documents is inimical to the interests of clarity, certainty and consistency in the planned-led system. It is only therefore permissible to look beyond the words of the policy if the policy is unclear or ambiguous. Whether it is ambiguous as part of the exercise whether it is ambiguous is part of the exercise of interpretation and thus is a matter of law and not a matter for evidence or judgment of witnesses. The test for reliance on extrinsic material is a high test, and there are very strong reasons for it. It is only met when the document sought to be relied on is either incorporated into the plan or explicitly referred to in it, and the ambiguity can only be resolved by referring to the extrinsic documentation, and that documentation is capable of resolving the ambiguity. Thus, if there is, we do obviously deny there is, but if there is ambiguity in the phrase small-scale B8 development, that ambiguity can only be resolved by reference to an extrinsic document if there was a definition of small-scale B8 development or something similar, which gives a clear answer to the ambiguity, and that document is incorporated into the JCS by explicit reference. Anything less will not do as a matter of law. Those tests will axiomatically not be met, where one has to try to piece together an argument as to what small-scale B8 development means from interpolation from incorporated documents, as Mr. Bolton does in his rebuttal, page 6. Such an approach also flies in the face of the case law deprecating forensic archaeology and involves undertaking an unduly elaborate exposition. It follows from the legal principles above that the documents which are not incorporated into the plan or explicitly referred to in it, and can I just add there, or come after it, are never relevant to the interpretation of policy. It further follows that if a policy is clear and unambiguous, then it should be interpreted only by reference to the contents of the plan itself, read fairly as a whole. Supporting text can aid the exercise, but it is not itself policy, it does not have the force of policy, and it cannot trump it. I then turn to the correct interpretation of small-scale B8 development. Despite the wide-ranging and, in our submission, impermissible debate with witnesses, there is in reality no difficulty with understanding this phrase in its context. There is no ambiguity in it, and there is only one way to understand it, applying the standard approach to interpretation summarised above. Our interpretation is simple, straightforward, obvious, and does not involve excessive legalism. It simply relies on what the words say. The first sentence of P36 allocates the land shown on the policies map for employment uses. The second defines what employment uses the allocation is for and what it will deliver. The site will provide a minimum of 40 hectares of B1, B2 and small-scale B8 development. There's no definition of the phrase small-scale B8 development, and thus one has to construe the phrase objectively in accordance with the language used in its proper context. That phrase is unambiguously concerned with what scale or quantum of development the site as a whole will deliver, the reference to minimum 40 hectares of development, with the scale of B1, B2 development across the allocation being unconstrained, but in contrast, the scale of B8 development being restricted to small scale. That is the sole purpose of the word small scale, to limit the scale of the total B8 development on the allocated land and to prevent B1, B2 being crowded out, to ensure that this site serves the purpose for which it was principally allocated. No further contextual analysis is required, but the following points confirm that this is the correct reading. First, the concept of development, singular, is a separate concept from units, plural, which go to make it up. The absence of the word unit or any indication that small scale is directed at the size of the units rather than the overall scale of the development is telling. Second, the reference to small scale is in the context of the total scale of development of 40 hectares and is thus referable to that, and it means a small part of that. Scale in this context is thus about total quantum extent and not just individual unit sizes. Our interpretation gives effect to each word actually used without requiring any elaboration, and it does so, and it does not rely on concepts which are not referred to in the words used. Fourth, where the JCS is referring to units rather than development, it says so. I'll give you a reference there to policy 32B, which you've already been taken to. Whether there is small-scale B8 development will be a function of a number of factors: the scale of individual units, the number of such units, and the total footprint, plot areas, mass, and volume of development. Individual unit size is just one element that contributes to the question as to whether that proposed is small-scale development. It is not just about the size of individual units, but the cumulative scale of B8 across the whole. It is said that the JCS is not prescriptive as to the mix of uses. That is correct in the generality, but that generality is expressly displaced here by the prescriptive limitation on B8 imposed by the word small scale. It thus follows that P36 is prescriptive of the mix of use and hence of the overall scale of B8 here. It's telling that despite the issue being squarely raised in the statement of case, and despite the amount of time spent on the question of small scale in the appellant's evidence in chief and cross-examination by the appellant, the only attempt to come up with a reason why the above interpretation is wrong was in the evidence in chief of Mr. Bolton, where he said for the policy to have the meaning the council contend for, it would have to use different words. Specifically, he said, it would have to say something like 40 hectares of B1, B2, together with a small amount of B8 development. The small amount of B8 development is the same as small-scale B8 development. The effect of the words proposed by Mr. Bolton have the same effect as our interpretation of the words actually used. He further went on to say that the policy would need to be worded differently if B1, B2, B8 uses were not to be looked at in the same way. But the approach to B1, B2 development is worded differently from the approach to B8 development in the policy itself. Thus, the words used in Policy 36 do what Mr. Walton says they would have to do to make the Council's interpretation correct. He then relies on the employment paper, and I'm going to come back to that later on. It's not understood how there can be any difficulty with understanding the phrase. The interpretation contended for gives effect to each word without any need to read in words or strain the meaning of words used or jump between different and or inconsistent concepts. It simply means what it says. In everyday English, small means minor, insignificant or little. Small scale means miniature or less than average, and that is the way it is used throughout the JCS. Whether a particular proposal meets this requirement is a matter of judgment, but anything more than minor or insignificant B8 is not permissible. The fact that Mr. Bennett and Mr. Crook considered there would be different thresholds of what is and what is not the small-scale development is neither surprising nor unusual. There will always be issues on the margins. But on the facts here, again on the appellant's own case, that proposed is not small-scale when the Council's interpretation of the phrase is applied. The appellant will no doubt claim that the interpretation argued for by the Council is a new idea raised by Minnie, effectively, rather than the Council itself. That is not relevant to whether it's the correct interpretation. The interpretation now argued for is either right or wrong. For the reasons set out above, it's right. As we said in opening, we do not shy away from stating that the appellant from the outset in formulating and promoting its proposals, and the Council officers in considering them, have all misunderstood the policy and failed to stand back and apply basic principles of interpretation to the clear words used. It was claimed that this interpretation was first raised in Mr. Bennett's written evidence and only elaborated on in opening in evidence in chief. That claim is clearly wrong. I give you the references that I went through in the statement of case, so I'm not going to read that. Well, I then turn from the correct interpretation to the application of the correct interpretation. There is no dispute that the development breaches Policy 36 on this correct interpretation. That was an inevitable concession, and it is fundamental to the merit of this application is compliance with the development plan and the planning balance. On the facts here, therefore, it's not necessary to consider precisely at what point a development will cease to be small scale. Here, 68% of the proposed footprint across 22 hectares is B8. It's impossible to regard that as small scale. Even if the rest of the allocation was built out in accordance with the master plan, the B8 would be 28% of a 40 hectare development. It's impossible to regard that as small scale B8 development either. The contrary interpretation. The appellant has to contend that small-scale development means non-strategic B8 units, and thus that small-scale means non-strategic and development means units. That interpretation is inconsistent with the words used, involves rewriting those words and introducing concepts which are different from and inconsistent with the actual words used. Further, it makes no sense and proceeds on the assumption that the allocation here was specifically for non-strategic B8 units, a proposition for which there's not a single hint in the words used or in the whole of the rest of the JCS. To generate the appellant's interpretation, the only word actually used, which does not have to be changed, is B8. We say that one cannot interpret a policy in a way which depends on reading almost every word differently from the words actually used. First, development does not mean units. Second, it is an incredible and impermissible stretch to claim that the objective understanding of small scale in the JCS is non-strategic. I develop that point further below. The appellant's strained interpretation relies on the focus being on the scale of the units and not on the scale of development, which is wrong for the reasons addressed above. And it has the following absurd consequences which make a nonsense of the words small-scale development. 68% again, which you're already aware of. Sorry, I'll read this. 68% of this development would have to be, sorry, 68% of this development is non-strategic BA development. That can't be small scale. To meet the 900 jobs on Mr. Bolton's exercise, 69% of the whole site would have to be non-strategic B8, and yet he maintains that would be small-scale BA development. And the whole of a 40-hectare site comprising upwards of 80,000 square metres could be non-strategic. I'll try that. The whole of a 40-hectare site comprising I'm at paragraph 38C, the whole, or 95% as you put it, of a 40-hectare site comprising upwards of 80,000 square metres could be non-strategic B8, and yet on the opponent's interpretation would still be small-scale B8 development. We must have no hesitation in making sure that the opponent's interpretation is wrong in law, because it is looking at the wrong thing, the individual units, rather than the scale of development. Correct interpretation of P36 is of very significant importance to the Council, both on this application and in respect of the remainder of the allocation. We know that if the market has free rein to deliver B1, B2 or non-strategic B8 units here, it will, subject to site-specific constraints, go for the latter. Acceptance of the opponent's interpretation will crowd out the B1, B2 for which this site is principally allocated and for which it is needed. And on to size of units. One element of the scale of overall development is the size of the individual units. The opponent's interpretation is also wrong in equating small scale with non-strategic units. The phrase small scale is used 15 times. The phrase small scale is used 15 times in the JCS. Small-scale local improvements in the context of the infrastructure delivery plan, small-scale infilling for housing, small-scale rural development, small-scale business in the reuse of rural buildings, small-scale hydropower, small-scale convenience or shopping facilities, small-scale retail development that meets local needs, small-scale business floor space uses, and small-scale business space. They all use this word small scale in a normal and everyday way. In none of those situations is small scale being used as a proxy for non-strategic. Indeed, all of those uses of the phrase small scale are inconsistent with the Council's interpretation of the phrase minor, significant, or all of those are consistent with the Council's interpretation of the phrase, namely minor, insignificant, or little. Further, whilst small-scale unit or small unit is not defined, smaller than large cannot be equated with small. There's a spectrum of scale from large through medium to small, as Mr. Bennett stated, small is at the bottom of the spectrum. The policy does not say small or medium, or smaller than strategic scale, or not large, it says small. Where the JCS wishes to refer to small and medium, it does so expressly. The fact the policy here refers to small only, thus tells us that it is not referring to medium. The box at JCS 820 is the only place where the spectrum of size is considered, and of course it distinguishes between small, medium, mid-box and large strategic units. Thus, even on the flawed approach of focusing on the scale of the units rather than on the scale of the development, the opponent's assumption that small scale is to be equated with non-strategic B8 is wrong. I then look at reliance on extrinsic material, and I've set out principles above. If you disagree that it is impermissible to look to any extrinsic material, you are only entitled to look at extrinsic material if it is incorporated into the
their JCS, and it resolves the ambiguity. We know that there is no definition of small-scale BA development in any of the extrinsic material that relied on by Mr. Bolton, and so this latter requirement cannot be met. Mr. Bolton contends the Council's interpretation cannot be correct because it would mean that the jobs target of 900 B8 in CD 14.7 could not be met. He carries out his own mathematical exercise, not carried out even in CD 14.7, to show what he says 900 jobs would mean in terms of the total scale of B8 across the allocation. That exercise is misconceived in principle and on the facts. He has gone to take his own interpolation to get to the point he makes. He does not identify anything in the document which adopts the approach he argues for. The methodology is his own. JCS 8.13 expressly rejects the approach he derives from CD 14.7. It tells us that the plan does not seek to subdivide employment targets into different use classes. Whatever the background workings may have been, the JCS itself expressly rejects that approach. The JCS thus expressly makes no assumption about the B8 jobs to be delivered here, and the exercise he undertakes is thus directly contrary to the express approach in the JCS. In any event, CD 14.7 does not support his analysis. It does not mention the P36 small-scale B8 formulation, and is just a, I should say just, a background paper to demonstrate at a high level that sufficient sites have been identified and only what each site might deliver. Section 10 is for Kettering, and it shows that the sites, if developed in the mix's success, would generate more than 3 times the jobs requirement. It's thus impossible to claim that this allocation envisages or requires a scale of B8 to provide 900 jobs. Further, the point backfires on the appellant because on its interpretation of the policy, it could, and Mr. Harvey's evidence would, have 95% B8, creating just 1,350 jobs here, massively under-delivering on the 2,550 jobs target for the allocation as a whole in CD 14.7. So even if it's correct to look at this document, it tells us that the small-scale limitation cannot be just on unit size. No other documents, especially those after the JCS, may be referred to. Mr. Bolton is unable to point to any definition anywhere in any incorporated document which tells us what small-scale B8 development means. Thus, small-scale B8 development is concerned with the total quantum of B8 development across the allocation. An element of that will be the scale of the units, but that is not the main or sole element. It necessarily follows that this application is directly contrary to the basic premise of P36. Small-scale limitation was introduced precisely to avoid this becoming a B8-dominated development, and to ensure it was instead overwhelmingly B1, B2 focused. It thus follows that this application is directly contrary to the fundamental premise of the policy applicable to this site. And now turn to why have this limitation on B8 scale. In short, the JCS identifies objectively assessed needs, including for both strategic and non-strategic scale units B8. It has a strategy which aims to generate 31,100 jobs to increase self-sufficiency, and secure growth in high-quality jobs to address the challenge of diversifying the economy into higher value sectors. To achieve that, it seeks to provide the right amount and type of employment land, and thus policy 23B ties the development to the scale and mix within commitments and approved master plans. Here, of course, we have the clear words of P36 to tell us what the mix the master plan had to provide: small-scale BA development. The JCS recognised the importance of logistics and the shortfall in provision of Kettering, and addresses this through major strategic allocations at J9 and J10, not here. To address the need for non-strategic relay units, policy 24A requires strategic distribution developments to provide a proportion of smaller units. Beyond that, JCS also identifies additional strategic employment sites to ensure there are a range of high-quality employment sites that are attractive to the market and provide sufficient choice and flexibility. To bring about economic growth as quickly as possible, Certain types of businesses, such as research and development, may find more commercially attractive locations within prominent strategic sites at the edge of towns. This is such a site, and explains the limitation on the scale of B8 development. This is not an allocation to meet B8 needs. They are elsewhere to meet principally B1, B2 needs to achieve the economic objectives of diversification into higher value sectors. To secure that, Policy 36 emphasises the quality of the offer here, which is necessary to achieve the objective. The choice and the flexibility to attract investment to secure high quality jobs and diversification into higher quality sectors.
Mr. Forster, can we just stop there
Yeah.
and take 10 minutes for someone from the council to find a microphone that works? Because you're straining yourself, and the people at the back are having difficulty hearing. We'll take 10 minutes. Come back at 11:15, or sorry, 12:15. Hopefully we've got something that works.
Can I see if we can bring more? If it's necessary, can I take that? Yeah. I'll see if we can get that one.
So.
correct interpretation of the definition? On the above interpretation, the allocation is overwhelmingly not for B8, and is instead for B1, B2. It is therefore, by definition, a B1, B2 led or focused allocation. It's really as simple as that. This short point flows inevitably and axiomatically from the limitation on the scale of B8. The following also inevitably follows when we are looking at policy requirements. They all have to be addressed in the context of B1, B2 led or focused allocation. Thus, there must be a network of high-quality landscaping and green infrastructure for and in the context of B1, B2, not principally B8. The allocation requires the creation of a high-quality environment for and in the context of a B1, B2 allocation, not B8. There must be that must be in a high-quality setting for and in the context of a B1, B2 allocation, not B8. And the proposal should provide contemporary and innovative buildings capitalising on views of the landscape to create an excellent place for B1, B2, not B8. Those requirements are necessarily conditioned and impacted upon by the nature of the development of the site, and in the context of the B1, B2 focus are inconsistent with the landscape, the environment, the setting being of a logistics park. We can see what the policy requirements means in the master plan for phase 2, the features of which are agreed to be as follows. You'll recognise this from the cross-examination of Mrs. Brockhurst. The plot sizes are significantly smaller than for the B8 on the application site and less compressed and dense. All but 2 of the plots are then broken down into separate buildings with a lower plot density, with landscape car parks, with each plot separated from the next by green avenues, paths, ponds and treed areas, with large landscape zones around the phase 2 as a whole, with a network of paths, non-linear roads and routes, with spacious setting for each building, capitalising on views to create an excellent sense of place. And of course, B1, B2 delivers a far higher density of jobs in a far lower floor space area than B8. And we know that high quality jobs the high quality jobs that the logistics sector can provide are focused on office floor space and higher paid jobs such as managerial positions. The apparent claim that general B8 jobs are high quality is simply not sustained by the words of the JCS and is implausible. The JCS is aiming for high quality jobs to reverse the low skilled, low pay growth in jobs in recent years. And that growth, we know, was B8 dominated. The apparent assertion that all B8 jobs are of equivalent quality to B1, B2 jobs for which this allocation is designed is mere assertion and is implausible. Phase 2 thus shows what the policy envisages: a business park in high quality landscaping integrating into the wider countryside in a high quality woodland setting, providing a high quality environment with a high density of high quality jobs. It's what the appellant consistently described as a campus-style development. All of the above flows from the words of Policy 36 properly understood, given that the allocation is for a B1, B2-led development. None of that would prevent large-scale B2 units being provided. We know from Mrs. Brockhurst that the larger units, of whatever use, would have to be on this site rather than on the rest of the allocation. There is thus a significant area where they are capable of being appropriately located, consistent with the above requirements. I come back to large-scale B2 units on the appeal site under landscape in a moment. Now turn to landscape, and the headline point is this. The essential point is this: the site was allocated for overwhelmingly B1, B2 development, with a requirement for all the factors I've just been through. It was thus not to be a logistics park, with the landscaping and environmental quality consistent with the constraints of a logistics park. Mrs. Brockhurst only claimed that the landscape proposals and landscape impacts here were acceptable in the context of the constraints of a logistics park. But that, of course, is a wholly different proposition from being acceptable for the allocated development. Of course, the council would strongly welcome large-scale B2 buildings here, but they would have to meet the above requirements and not be crammed together hard up to the tree boundary, obliterating all the meadow and grassland. The landscape context and the proposals. The existing context, you will have formed your own view from your site visit, but the following points need to be emphasised. Mrs. Brockhurst said that the landscape is highly urbanised based on the existing KBP and proposed IMK extension to the south and southwest of the appeal site. It is plainly, that highly urbanised description is plainly not an apt description of the landscape of the appeal site itself or its surroundings to the west, north and east. The representations from the public on Wednesday were testament to just how inapt a description highly urbanised or even peri-urban is to this site. You will have experienced the scale of the views, the relative tranquillity and rurality, and the significant distance of the built form from much of the appeal site. Judgments reached by the council on a single unit extension to KBP do not tell us about the acceptability of this scale of development here. The second part of the existing context is that Mrs. Brockhurst contended that the council, through the allocation, intended to consolidate the urban context in this location, which she understood as encouraging the replication of Kettering Business Park to the north, she understood as encouraging the replication of Kettering Business Park, extending it to the north and east across the site. That is not what the policy requires. Mrs. Brockhurst contended that the allocation envisaged delivering a quasi-industrial commercial townscape characterised by simple form buildings of large mass with notably large footprints. That is an incorrect understanding of the policy framework. The proposals fill the site. They extend to the root protection areas of the surrounding woods, presenting very large elevations with the gaps between almost entirely comprised of hard standing for vehicle manoeuvring and parking, all in what she described as a compressed layout. Mrs. Brockhurst asked herself the correct central question, namely whether the character and appearance of the landscape will experience levels of harm greater than anticipated with the implementation of Policy 36. That necessarily required consideration of what was envisaged under Policy 36. She assumed, as the fundamental starting point for my analysis, I've changed my analysis to just for English, that the allocation was permissive of B8 development in the form of a logistics park of this scale and density on the appeal site. It is not. She assumed that the appeal site was appropriate for B8 of very substantial, significant scale across 5 buildings between 2.5 and 7.5 thousand square metres here, and was acceptable in principle. It's not. Given that starting point as a given and fixed parameter, she had to consider where was the most appropriate location to place this scale of buildings, given that she assumed that they were acceptable in principle under the allocation. In that context, her professional view was that landscape and visual impacts were acceptable for a logistics park, given the constraints inherent in the operational requirements of a logistics park. Straight roads, very large HGV manoeuvring areas, ubiquitously high-sided, big footprint and large mass buildings, all compressed together to get the highest possible volume out of the site. Those constraints do not arise under a policy-compliant development. She candidly and inevitably accepted that she had not addressed the proposals against a B1, B2 focus-led allocation. It will be said, of course, that large-scale B2 could have similar landscape impacts to equivalent B8 scale. There is strong support from the council for a suitable quantum of larger buildings in this location. But under Policy 36, there is no blank cheque for cramming larger buildings together, even if they're policy-compliant B2 ones. I then turn to internal landscaping. The application started life with an obviously unacceptable substantial removal of trees, but with significantly greater space for internal landscaping than now provided. That degree of internal landscaping was of course judged necessary to meet the high-quality landscape requirements of Policy 36. There was a pedestrian through route to the countryside beyond, to the north. Given the appellant's fixed starting point of very large total quantum of B8 on the appeal site, the effect of pulling the development area in so as to remove the tree take was to significantly compress the layout of the buildings, substantially increase the density and substantially reduce the potential for internal landscaping, as was accepted by Mrs. Brockhurst. The extent of the reduction in internal landscaping is self-evident and substantial to the south of Plot 1 from the small-scale plans. Review of the Detailed plans further north serves to highlight how extremely limited is the internal landscaping within the heart of the development, and how markedly different it is from that originally proposed. The pockets she describes are no substitute for high quality landscaping. We say it's impossible to regard this as high quality landscaping envisaged in, as the high quality landscaping envisaged in P36, and which a policy compliant non-logistics mix would be required to deliver. There's almost nil landscaping between the plots or within the HGV and car parking areas. The landscaping down the spine road is substantially reduced. There are only small pockets of isolated green space. The buildings are all hard up to the root protection areas all the way around, with the result that there's no space to retain any of the meadows and glades, and that the elevations will present starkly to the informal path to the north and northeast, that should say northeast, enclosing and dominating the currently highly valued informal route which is specifically referred to in policy. The reliance on the provision to the south, the suds and the retained meadow, can hardly constitute the high quality landscaping of the whole, and are in any event physically divorced from the woodland setting. The reason for the failures was expressly accepted by Mrs. Brockhurst to be a function of the B8 uses and their scale, a function of delivering a logistics park. But of course the logistics park is inconsistent with policy, and the constraint on landscape is thus a further harm of the non-compliance with the allocation. Fundamentally, the harm arises from the excessive quantum and compressed nature of the development and the provision of a logistics park with its constraints, removing the scope to do that which P36 properly understood requires, to integrate into the countryside and provide high quality landscaping, as described in detail above and as illustrated in the master plan for phase 2. You of course will have formed your own view on visual harms. It's not necessary to address them here, nor is it necessary to address the consequence of the scale and form of development on the informal path and in the north and northeast corner, which I assume you walked here yesterday. As to recreational value, you can be in no doubt from the impressive public turnout on Wednesday evening as to the recreational value of the meadow in the appeal site. It will be entirely lost over the mass of the development. All existing footpaths, all existing informal paths will be lost from it, and none of the recreational value of it will be retained. Of course, the site is allocated for development, but P36 is a carefully framed allocation to maintain and retain the value to which the public so eloquently attested, so far as is consistent with a high quality Welsh landscape development integrated into the countryside. The master plan for phase 2 shows what that means and how it should be delivered. Public access, routes through, spacious layouts and generous landscaping to integrate the development into the countryside and to retain its recreational value. The appeal proposals do the exact opposite on almost every point. Then turn to the other requirements of Policy 36. Policy 36 requires the master plan to cover a range of matters. We accept that the development can come forward in phases, but each phase must meet the requirements of Policy 36 so far as relevant to it. Phase 1 does not do so for the following reasons. First of all, connectivity. A key constraint on the allocation was the physical and visual isolation from Kettering and the lack of integration with it. A key aspect of P36 was therefore the need to integrate the allocation with Kettering via Weekley Wood Lane. That is why Policy 36C expressly requires permeable and safe routes that connect Kettering North to and I'll highlight areas to the south of Weekley Wood Lane and to the countryside. It is not a nice to have. The need for integration of safe routes through to the south of Weekley Wood Lane applies to each part of the allocation and not just to phase 2. It is fundamental to the acceptability of the allocation. It's necessary to overcome what would otherwise be substantial adverse implications of the development of the site caused by its relative isolation and lack of connectivity with Kettering. The master plan shows the way to address this is through pedestrian and cycle routes through the allocation to Weekley Wood Lane, dedicated crossings at Weekley Wood Lane, and links into the path south of Weekley Wood Lane. None of that is delivered as part of phase 1, with the result that this standalone application does not address that key constraint on the development of the site. There are no pedestrian cycle or cycle routes from Weekley Wood Lane to the site via the allocation, no safe crossing of Weekley Wood Lane, and no improved links to the south. The appellant accepts that under their proposal for pedestrians from south of Weekley Wood Lane to access the site, they would however have to cross the A43 without, that should be Weekley Wood Lane, without a dedicated crossing and use an unmade path or detour via the A43. P36 expressly provides that they should not have to do the latter, and the former is obviously unacceptable. Neither option is a convenient, permeable and safe route as required by P36C. I then turn to isolation and standalone development. Further, as a matter of fact, the site is at the far north end of the allocation, furthest removed from Weekley Wood Lane, with which the allocation was meant to integrate. It abuts, is accessed via, and reads as a spatial extension to the Kettering Business Park, rather than the required extension of Kettering across Weekley Wood Lane. It is markedly isolated visually and physically from that of which it is meant to be an extension. The fact that the allocation as a whole may in the future resolve that isolation is nothing to the point. This scheme has to be assessed on its own merits. Mr. James proves our point when he refers to Phase 2 integrating with the northern fringe of the town. Phase 2 does what the policy requires. This application does not. It is unacceptable in principle to have an isolated standalone development unconnected to Kettering here. A key part of the logic of the allocation was that it was an extension to Kettering and not just an extension to Kettering Business Park. As to the master plan, there's no objection from the council to this application being determined without an agreed master plan, as long as the master plan shown is acceptable and delivers the requirements of P36. The master plan for Phase 2 is acceptable and does so. The master plan for Phase 1 is not acceptable and does not do so. If the developer chooses to adopt a phased approach, it is incumbent on it to deliver acceptable standalone developments on their own merits at each phase, and not to have to rely on the possibility of future phases coming forward on the basis of the indicative master plan to make the standalone application acceptable. Yet that is the position adopted here. The Section 106 obligation does not remove this requirement because all it does is secure the making of an application, not its delivery. I then turn to development plan compliance. First and fundamentally, the application is directly contrary to the essential premise of the allocation. The application provides for a form of development which is exactly that which the JCS expressly precludes. The site was expressly not allocated for a logistics park with large, tightly packed warehouses and their hard standings. That breach is fatal because it is a breach of the part of the policy addressing precisely this site. The choice as to what this site is for has been made through the statutory processes and is expressly not for this form of application, specifically and carefully preventing this form of application. Anything other than small-scale BA development, properly understood, must go elsewhere. That breach further leads to the landscape harms and breach of policy identified. The fact that the site is allocated for development does not justify this intense form of development, the failure to deliver high-quality landscaping, and to properly integrate it into the countryside. The recreational value of the appeal site is not retained or enhanced. The application only consumes its own smoke in respect of all other matters. P36 is not complied with because of the lack of connectivity through Weekley Wood Lane. There is no extension to the circular walk or the bridleway network under 36G. The application is thus in clear breach of all key aspects of P36. P22 to 24 cannot be prayed in aid to outweigh that breach. P36 is the site-specific response to the objectively assessed needs, challenges faced by the councils, the vision and the imperative to generate high quality jobs, and the accepted general importance of B8 reflected, for example, in P24. The JCS sets out a framework as to how to meet competing needs, and is all about provision of the right amount of and quality of land in the right places, and the delivery of development of the appropriate scale and mix on them. Fundamentally, P36 tells us what that means here, and the proposals are at odds with essential elements of it. There is thus very clear and very significant non-compliance with the development plan as a whole. Then turn to need. The appellant puts forward a other material considerations need case based on the need for non-strategic B8 units, contending that the site should meet that need rather than the subsisting B1, B2 need for which it was principally allocated. The appellant accepts that there remains unmet need for a large-scale B2, as well as the B1, B2 shown on the master plan for phase 2. The site is therefore still required for the very purpose for which it was allocated. JCS has responded to the challenges faced by the area and the opportunities available by making very substantial provision for B8 development. Its express route to provision for non-strategic B8 needs is via Policy 24A. Even in the context of the acknowledged advantages of B8 and the opportunities Northamptonshire has to benefit from B8, the JCS did not identify this site for non-strategic or medium-scale B8 as it could have done, instead carefully limiting the scale of B8 development. B8 need. As to the B8 need, the JCS allocated sites to meet the then established and objectively assessed need. Its approach to meeting non-strategic B8 needs and strategic allocations was articulated in Policy 24A. Strategic sites delivering strategic scale B8 should also include the provision of a proportion of floor space in the form of smaller employment units. There is no issue on demand or viability preventing that being delivered where strategic scale B8 is provided. Even in the context of the above need and the location of North Northamptonshire in the Golden Triangle, the JCS consciously and deliberately decided not to allocate the site to meet that need. Instead, it made very wide-ranging strategic allocations elsewhere. There has been very significant delivery and there remains a very significant pipeline. The ICENI-HENA document is for the purposes of informing a future development plan, which will decide which of the range of figures in ICENI to adopt, if any, and to determine whether, when, where and how to meet the scale of need identified. The JCS has done its job. Having said all that, it's accepted that despite the very large number of permissions and allocations, and despite the sites yet to be built out, there is a significant scale of unmet need for non-strategic B8 units in Northamptonshire, which this proposal would help meet. Given the evidence of Mr. Bennett and Mr. Ward, it's not necessary for us to delve deeper into this issue. The appellant has established a need case to which it is accepted significant weight should be attached. The same need case would of course also be said to apply to the whole allocation, and as Mr. Harvey correctly accepted, given a free rein, the remainder of the allocation would go to B8-2. Then turn to B2 need. We focused on B2 rather than B1 need because B1 need can be met on phase 2. Larger scale B2 need cannot be met on phase 2 for the reasons given by Mrs. Brockhurst. There is common ground that there is significant unmet B2 need, including for larger scale B2. Harvey's Appendix 3, which is expressly only recording actual specifically relevant existing inquiries, of the 11 inquiries listed, he told us that 4 were either wholly or partly for large scale B2. Then Mr. Ward's Appendix 1, recent inquiries were dominated by B2, and he was not cross-examined on that table. Mr. Ward in evidence in chief. In all instances of B2 inquiries, it has been very problematic to find space for successful and growing businesses, with very little B2 stock available and vacant. The industrial estates are full or nearly full, and obsolescence of 1980 stock is a significant issue. Ward cross-examination. The real challenge we have is with B2. We just aren't able to provide the units. Because that demands priority that I get asked for, that's the focus I am looking at. because it provides the higher value jobs and the higher density than non-strategic B8 would. In his coalface experience, there was more of a need for B2 than B8. Harvey, in cross-examination, there is a demand generally across the board. There's a strong market for B8 in particular, but there is also demand for B2 as well. There is demand for all sizes. He had not been asked to consider more than one B2 larger scale unit on the appeal site. I was just asked if there was demand for B8, he told me, and he did not refute that there was a wider B2 need for larger scale buildings. Mr. Bolton's evidence in chief agreed that there was a need for non-strategic B1, B2 under 9,300 square metres, and stated that whilst here that there is much longer demand for non-strategic B8 than non-strategic B2, he was not saying that there isn't a local demand for B2. All I am saying is that there is a stronger demand for non-strategic B8 on the evidence, he said. In cross-examination, he accepted there is a need for B2, including large-scale B2. He accepted Mr. Harvey's evidence that large-scale B2 need is not limited to Simrise. He accepted there is a need for B1, B2, and the proposals in the master plan would meet some of that need. He stated he was not denying the evidence for need for B1, B2 from Mr. Harvey. Mr. James accepted there is a market demand for B2 units, accepted there is a market demand for more than one large-scale B2 unit, accepted there was very clear market demand for B8 and demand for all other categories. In response to a question, if it's right that this site was allocated for B1, B2, and there is an unmet need and demand for B2, you would accept that losing the ability to provide what is allocated for here trumps the provision of B8. He did not claim, in answer, he did not claim that this application would not displace that need, which would say would not displace that need, instead saying that there is still a significant need for B8. The master plan itself presupposes a very significant unmet need for B1, B2, 47,000 square metres. In cross-examination, all relevant witnesses for the appellant confirmed that the master plan was designed to meet that need and rejected the alternative notion I put to them, that the master plan was just would otherwise be just a meaningless drawing on a piece of paper that did not reflect what would actually be built here. We therefore have a stark position. There's a choice to be made as to which need to meet. Fundamentally, the JCS has made that choice here. Rather than meet that need, Mr. Harvey was clear that the appellant was focused on addressing and meeting B8 need. He had been asked, he says, whether there was demand for B8. So the question of the mix of uses started from a flawed starting point, namely that the allocation allows for predominantly B8 development. The appellant had not investigated whether the site was still required for its predominant allocated uses. The appellant, in cross-examination of Mr. Bennett, was keen to stress the importance of providing non-strategic B8 to avoid the potential for crowding out of other uses. But that is precisely what this proposal does. It crowds out B2 from the site when B2 and B1 is specifically what the site was predominantly allocated for. There are therefore two competing needs for this site. The one for which it was allocated and for which it has been judged suitable, and for which it is still needed, and the need for non-strategic B8, for which it has expressly not been allocated and for which it has not been judged suitable. It is impossible to understand how the latter can trump or supplant the former, quite the reverse. Where a site is allocated to meet a need which persists, it's very difficult to see how it can be released to meet a different need which was specifically excluded from the allocation. I then turn to the planning balance. The question of interpretation of policy 36 and what the allocation for is fundamental to the planning balance. And on our interpretation, the site is allocated principally for B1, B2. B1, B2 need persists. Proposed as in breach of what P36 is allocated for. That breach goes to the heart of the premise of the allocation and does that which the allocation specifically precludes. It results in the unallocated B8 need trumping and crowding out the need for which the site was allocated. That breach should be accorded very significant weight, and we say is itself fatal. It's difficult to see how the fact that B8 demand may be stronger than the accepted persisting B2 demand could, save in the most exceptional case, justify using the site other than for its allocated use. The need for unallocated uses trumping the need for allocated uses is inimical to a plan-led system. The benefits of meeting unmet strategic B8 need and the provision of jobs are accepted and are to be given significant weight, as is the provision of the B2 unit. There is no dispute on the maths of the economic benefits, but there's been no assessment of the comparative loss of economic benefits in delivering this scheme compared to a policy-compliant B1, B2-led scheme. This proposal prevents the latter, and so it is misconceived to fail to address the net position and simply to claim the gross benefits. Despite Mr. Jones' claims to the contrary, the development only consumes its own smoke in all other respects. Doing so cannot be claimed as a benefit. Other harms, the landscape harm is significant. This is simply the wrong scale and density of compressed development, failing to meet the requirements of policy and having the adverse effects to which Miss Webber referred, and which Ms. Brockhurst excused as a necessary consequence of a logistics park. The absence of the connections through to Weekley Wood Lane are to be given significant weight. Those connections were required to overcome a significant constraint to the allocation, namely isolation. There is in addition the harm caused by the isolated standalone nature of the development. In summary, read correctly and in its proper context, P36 is clear that the site has been allocated for a B1, B2 focused business park integrated into a high quality woodland setting to deliver a high density of high quality jobs. The breadth and strength and eloquence of the very large number of representatives on Wednesday evening cannot have but impressed with their clarity and conviction the importance they place on the area. A policy compliant scheme, as for example shown in phase 2 of the master plan, would retain much of that value whilst delivering a high quality development integrated into the countryside that the policy requires. P36 is fundamentally not permissive of a logistics park with large, tightly packed warehousing, and therefore this appeal should be dismissed.
So I've sent just about 30 seconds ago the final version of our closings to Julie, because it was Julie and a load of other people as well at the council. I've also sent them to Helen Skinner for forwarding to you. So as far as I'm concerned, as soon as, obviously, well, it's 10 to 1 now, so presumably we'll take a short break, but either way, I'm happy to just read from, start reading whenever. But if you want, I don't know if you want to argue, you probably do want to argue in advance of starting, or I'm not sure. But,
I'm quite happy to read it on the screen.
Fine. Well, as soon as it comes through to you, so as soon as it comes through, I don't know. I mean, if you, I'm happy to start if you want. I have just sent it to everybody. I've sent it to lots of people. To both of you.
Don't we take just over 10 minutes? Come back at 1 o'clock. Hopefully, case officer.
Yeah, it is Helen, isn't it? Yes. Okay.
Hopefully, she hasn't left off to put the washing in.
I have also asked, obviously, if you can, if a hard copy can be run off beforehand, then it might be doable.
So we'll take 10 minutes. Come back at 1 o'clock.
Right. When you go, Wales.
So no plan, no
that the policy required individual V8 units to be around 900 square metres, and that it requires the scheme to be something called campus-led. Bizarrely, those points appear to have been abandoned in Mr. Forsdick's closings. I'll come back to that. Mr. Bennett accepted that at the time the development plan was adopted, the expectation was that 2/3 of the site's floor space would be V8. He accepted that the appeal scheme is consistent with that expectation, but of course the interpretation now put forward by the council isn't. Mr. Bennett and Mr. Ward for the council agreed that there is a need and demand for each one of the units proposed. Mr. Bennett described the scheme's B2 unit as a significant benefit. He accepted the scheme's provision of 5 B8 units is a benefit which attracts significant weight too. The appeal scheme brings forward only one part of the wider allocation, but we agree that this is an acceptable approach. Mr. Bennett accepted the policy does not require the development to be delivered through a single planning application or for all of the allocations components to come forward at the same time. I'll come back to that one, having heard the council's closings also. We agree that the scheme will be served by excellent public transport and that it will have no unacceptable impacts on the highway network. We agree the scheme will deliver ecological benefits, including a biodiversity net gain in excess of 13%. In the end, this is a much needed scheme on a sustainably located site allocated for the proposed uses in the adopted plan, which makes it all the more disappointing that this application has sat undetermined by the council from as long ago as March of 2020 before the appeal was finally brought against its failure to determine the application in August of 2023. Mr. Stinscombe wants us now to, quote, go back to the drawing board. We've been at the drawing board for over a decade now. We're only a few years away from the end of the plan period. The plan expects the whole allocated site to have come forward before long. Mr. Stinscombe keeps telling us that the position should be plan-led. Reference after reference to a plan-led system in his closings, but as we'll explain, the effect of his case is to frustrate this development plan's operation at every turn. Further, the litany of objections made by the council at this inquiry bear no relation to its pre- and post-application responses over a period of several years. The scheme accords with the allocation policy, it accords with the plan when read as a whole, it's supported by a raft of other compelling considerations, and in those circumstances under section 38(6 the appeal should be allowed. We close our case under a number of headings that I will read as I get to each one. The first is that the appeal site presents a major opportunity for North Northamptonshire. This part of Northamptonshire, close to what is referred to as the Golden Triangle, is one of the most important areas for industrial and logistics uses in the country. In 2016, this council's predecessor adopted a plan, the North Northamptonshire 2016 core strategy, which intended to take advantage of its location and to achieve major economic growth. The strategy recognises there's a need to deliver many more industrial and logistics sites to support its employment targets, which aimed for a net increase of a minimum of 31,100 jobs in the area by 2031. Well over halfway through the plan period, the council is many thousands of jobs short of achieving that target, with Mr. Bolton identifying a period not of progress but of stagnation over the last 3 years. To facilitate that delivery, the council identified 4 growth towns, of which Kettering is one, and those are supposed to take the greatest share of new housing, and they're supposed to be the focus of employment, retail and leisure development. And Kettering is to be a focus for infrastructure investment high road facilities to support, quote, major employment. Kettering is, the strategy tells us, the main employment centre in North Northamptonshire. The appeal site, which is within the settlement boundary to the north of Kettering, next to existing commercial development, is part of a wider site allocated through the strategy as a, quote, major opportunity to develop employment uses in a sustainable location within a top-tier settlement to help deliver some of the jobs and the economic growth which are envisaged by this plan. Mr. Bennett put it on behalf of the
council, the allocation plays an important role, not only for Kettering, but also for the wider North Northamptonshire economy. Second heading, the appeal scheme accords with the allocation policy. Policy 36 allocates land at Kettering North for a minimum of 40 hectares of B1, B2 and small-scale B8 development, together with approximately 3 hectares of leisure. The central issue, as you know very well now, sir, for you to decide at this inquiry is whether or not the appeal scheme falls within that description, and in particular whether it offers small-scale B8 development within the meaning of the policy. Now, in approaching that issue, the starting point is to recognise that when it comes to how and in what sectors employment growth is delivered, the core strategy was always intended to be flexible. Although you'd be forgiven for missing that from the council's evidence and indeed from its submissions to you today. The core strategy policies are, the council tells us, intended to operate as a flexible, enabling framework in order to deliver minimum jobs targets. And the strategy itself says that given the challenges that North Northamptonshire has faced in delivering economic growth, the plan, can you believe it, does not seek to be overly prescriptive. Against that backdrop, the core strategy does not include an express definition of small-scale B8. It didn't need to. The core strategy expressly defines larger or strategic distribution developments as those involving individual units of 9,300 square metres or more. Of course, the parties now agree that smaller units in the strategy at 8.19 is talking about B8 units, which are less than 9,300 square metres. There is then a distinction drawn between developments which are strategic or large, more than 9,300 square metres, and those which are non-strategic or small scale, those that are less than 9,300 square metres. Mr. Bolton emphasised that this interpretation does not require recourse to background materials or even to explanatory text. It follows from a straightforward reading of policies, policy 36, read alongside policy 24, which is what we're supposed to do. This was the approach that to policy 36, which was taken by the council's own officers until recently. More broadly, it accords with what Mr. Bolton described as the known meaning of the term in the industry, including as expressed by the council's own expert advisors in this area, who are ICNI, who define smaller stock or non-strategic B8 stock as stock which is under 9,000 square metres, against a definition of large B8 units which are over 9,000 square metres. Mr. Forsdick thinks it's incredible. He thinks it's strained. He thinks it's impermissible. Well, it might be to him, but it's been the consistent position of his clients over many years, and it accords with the view of his clients' expert advisors who, unfortunately, have not appeared in support of the council at this inquiry. In this case, the B8 units all fall well below the 9,300 square metre threshold. The scheme would therefore bring forward small-scale B8 development in accordance with the allocation policy, and really, that should be the end of that. But it isn't, not quite, because over the course of this inquiry, the council has sought to reimagine the allocation policy in a variety of different ways, some of which directly contradict one another. Note in the footnote that at 23B of his closings, Mr. Forsdick says small scale is not about unit sizes. At 23E, he says it is about unit sizes. It was a little bit puzzling for a phrase which he and Mr. Stinch can be telling us is so blindingly obvious and straightforward on its face, even though the two of them disagree with one another on what it means. Anyway, first, each variation of the council's case has been misconceived, because first, at least until Mr. Forsdick's closings, the council had said that units will only be small-scale B8 if they're smaller than 929 square metres. Now, I say until this morning, barely mentions this point in his closings, barely mentions it, despite it having been the focus of the council's evidence. He now calls the approach of reading small scale to refer to unit sizes, he calls it flawed. He even though obviously that's exactly the approach taken in his own case and exactly what Mr. Bennett had been saying to this inquiry. Anyway, it appears to have been abandoned. In any event, it's an approach which finds no basis in policy. The council relies or relied, the green box barely gets a mention in the closings, only on a footnote to explanatory text, this green box. The footnote, however, does not purport to define the phrase at issue, which is small scale B8. It refers to a report from LSH in 2014. That report identified small units as those with a floor space of less than 929 square metres. Mr. Bennett told us he'd not read that report when he prepared his evidence. When we took him to it, he accepted that its analysis of small business units doesn't in fact refer to warehousing or logistics at all, nor does it seek to define small-scale B8. Mr. Bennett accepted also that over the last decade, almost no B8 floor space had been let in North Northamptonshire at the unit sizes he tells us that are envisaged for this site. On his approach to deliver the jobs the council envisaged for the site, we'd need 85 units, 85 B8 units, which shows the ridiculous knots the council's tied itself into at this inquiry. And as Mr. Bolton explained, this would not provide the choice or the flexibility that the core strategy expects. The approach would also be inconsistent with Mr. Bennett's own evidence in his own employment note, where he told us that his references to smaller scale B8, they all mean non-strategic B8, and he agreed that bringing forward more, quote, smaller scale B8, like the units in this scheme, is exactly what Iceni suggests is the remedy to the risk of overcrowding by large B8 occupiers, about which Mr. Bennett tells us he's so concerned. So just to be absolutely clear, Mr. Forstick's point on crowding out in his closings at para 40 is directly contradicted, not only by Iceni, but also by Mr. Bennett, his own witness, both of whom confirm that the uses at risk of being crowded out are our uses and non-strategic B8 uses of the kind proposed here. And the remedy to that crowding out is precisely to grant permission for more non-strategic B8 development. Alas. Next, it is said that small-scale B8 means that the scheme should be, quote, B1, B2 led, which Mr. Bennett told us is something in the region of 95% B1, B2 and 5% B8. Mr. Crook thought was something in the region of 80% and 20% B8. Of course, all very interesting. It bears no relation at all to the wording of the policy. Policy 36 does not prescribe a specific mix between uses. It does not even, unlike the allocation for land at Kettering South, suggest that any uses should be a, quote, focus. That was a choice. It was deliberate. The allocation site is one of the strategic employment sites intended, so the plan tells us, to provide choice and to provide flexibility. And Mr. Bennett agreed if a site is intended to provide choice and flexibility, the split between uses should not be over-engineered. It's a bit late for that now. The 95-5 split now put forward by the council does not even remotely correspond with its own expectations when the core strategy was submitted for examination. Of course, neither does the 80-20 split put forward by the Rule 6 party. It's telling that, albeit Mr. Bennett and Mr. Crook continually repeated that they were both following the very plain language of the policy on this point. They have totally different conceptions of what it means. Jobs figures which underpinned the Policy 36 allocation necessarily implied, as Mr. Bolton demonstrates, that over 2/3 of the allocation's overall floor space was expected to be in B8 use. Mr. Bennett didn't challenge any of Mr. Bolton's arithmetic. He accepted that the appeal scheme is consistent with the council's expectations when the strategy was adopted, while his own evidence was worlds apart from it. That the policy refers to B-class development rather than B-class use is a point on which Mr. Stinchcombe relies, and indeed, to be fair, Mr. Forstick too. To infer a point on mix is a distinction without a difference. B-class development comes forward in B-class units. This policy is a policy which purposely has no prescribed mix. The footnote says, footnote 27, note Mr. Crooks' interpretation of the supposed mix repeated in Mr. Stinchcombe's closings, i.e. that 40 hectares includes only B1 and B2, and that the B8 bit is outside the 40 hectares, is not supported by the council and is obviously wrong on this much at least. policy 36 is clear. The policy requirement is for all three things, B1, B2 and B8. The and links all three kinds of development into the overall minimum of 40 hectares. At C, in the main text, the council had also criticised the scheme on the basis, I say had also criticised the scheme on the basis that it's not a campus-style business park. Now, Mr. Forsdick told us in opening that this was one of the policy's essential requirements. It seems to have been abandoned today. In any event, those words, campus style, they're not in the core strategy. The council had lifted them from a draft interim vision document prepared by the appellant more than a decade ago, which was intended to provide a, quote, flavour of how the site, quote, could be developed. The council, of course, had the power through a local plan to decide how the site should be developed. Its choice is now reflected in policy 36. It could have chosen to require a campus-style business park on this site. It didn't, and it can't now introduce such a policy requirement through this appeal. And just as a footnote, we note that the council, and indeed the Rule 6, talk about Mrs. Brockhurst's use of the term logistics park as if that's some kind of concession as to whether the scheme accords with policy 36. Obviously wasn't. She was describing the scheme as a landscape architect, not logistics witness. She wasn't asked to give any view on whether its units comprise non-strat B8 within the meaning of the policy or not. Point D on page 11, the council and the Rule 6 party have also claimed that our reliance on background materials is impermissible. Now, that line of argument, firstly, totally misunderstands the use which we have made of background reports. That use is to show that our interpretation of the policy corresponds with the approach taken by the council's expert advisors. That line of argument rests on an assertion that policy 36 is unambiguous, and it's not, as Mr. Bennett has accepted that it is not. And that line of argument, thirdly, is at odds with the council's own approach to policy 36, which, unlike ours, seeks to import words not included in the policy from materials that we produced, campus style, etc. And indeed, the litany of references throughout the Rule 6 party's closings to a 2011 interim draft framework document intended to provide a flavour of how the site could be developed. I don't mind referring to that. In the end, for all its painful and often mutually inconsistent contortions, the council's case on small-scale B8 goes nowhere. This case is not saved by Mr. Forsdick's repeated refrain that the interpretation of planning policy is a matter of law. Things have moved on since Tesco and Dundee in response to, quote, concerns after that case about what the courts called the over-legalisation of the planning process, which the Supreme Court called particularly unfortunate. One can only imagine what the court would have made of the council's case at this inquiry. The courts have more recently been keen to emphasise that planning policy should be interpreted in a straightforward manner, without undue or elaborate exposition. The courts will often say that the policy means what it says, and that it's your job, sir, to apply it with realism and good sense in the circumstances that arise. Policies should not, the courts have confirmed, normally require an intricate discussion of their meaning. So, whilst Mr. Forsdick's right to say the interpretation of policy is a matter of law, that does not mean that inquiries like this one should be infected with what the courts call excessive legalism. In fact, that's the very state of affairs the courts have sought to avoid. So what you are required to do, sir, is approach this policy with realism, to approach it with good sense, give effect to the words actually used, B1, B2, small scale B8, and indeed other related policies, strategic distribution developments involving individual units of 9,300 square metres or more. Use supporting text as an aid to interpretation. You're not supposed to add in words like campus style, B1, B2 led, or high quality business park, or whatever, which do not appear in the plan. Approached in that way, the appeal scheme accords with the policy. It delivers B2, it delivers small scale B8, that's what's required. The policy also requires a comprehensive master plan to be agreed by the local planning authority. Now on that, Mr. Bennett agreed that the policy allows for development to come forward in phases, as is envisaged here. Just pausing on that footnote, Mr. Crook, for the Rule 6 party, also agreed that the policy allows for the scheme to come forward in phases. So Mr. Stinchcombe's deprecating references to, quote, piecemeal development in his closings aren't understood. We all agree that Policy 36 supports a scheme coming forward in phases. B, the policy does not require the development to be for a single planning application, or for the allocations, for all of the allocations components to come forward at the same time. So albeit at 89 of Mr. Fallstick's closings, he's suggesting that phase 1 does itself require, for example, connections to the south over Weekley Wood Lane. Mr. Bennett's accepted that what matters isn't whether the first phase of the development does everything, but whether it does what it can. And the same goes for Mr. Fallstick's 96. The implication is that each phase of the development has to do it all. When we know, and Mr. Bennett's agreed, that in fact the policy allows each phase to cover off those parts of the overall master plan requirements which are relevant to that phase. Nor, sir, does the policy require, for example, a guarantee at the time that phase 1 is permitted on the nature or form of applications for subsequent phases. Mr. Stinchcombe's complaint at 77 of his closings that no, quote, mechanism exists before you to guarantee phase 2's progress is true, but it's irrelevant because policy 36 doesn't require any such guarantee. A site-wide master plan is needed in order to show that it's possible for all of the allocations components to come forward by the time the final phase is completed, i.e. to show that the first phase doesn't prejudice the rest. Mr. Bennett accepted that the site-wide master plan included in the design development brief does that. Mr. Fallstick confirms in his closings that the phase 2 master plan is acceptable and that it's policy compliant. Mr. Bennett accepted that policy 36 does not require the master plan to be approved at some committee meeting. It doesn't require the adoption of a DPD or an SPD. Mr. Bennett accepted that the council's agreement can come in any form, including through the development management process. So Mr. Stinchcombe is wrong. We agree, and the council agree, to say in his closings that an agreed master plan must precede a planning application. Not so, and he's also wrong to say in his closings that policy 36 requires schemes coming forward to accord with the agreed master plan. It doesn't say that. How the master plan requirements are addressed in subsequent applications is all a matter of judgment for the local planning authority. Mr. Crook, for the Rule 6 party, also accepted that there's no requirement for the council to consult on the master plan, unlike, for example, the master plan required by policy 33 of the core strategy. Now here, the master plan's not been agreed by the local planning authority, but as Mr. James explained, given that there is a master plan which has been before the council for a number of years, which delivers on all the requirements in policy 36, which are relevant to this first phase, there is accordance with the policy as a whole. That was the view taken by the council when it granted permission for I.M. Kelly Phase 2, a scheme which falls within the boundary of Policy 36, recently approved in the absence of an agreed master plan. Note Mr. Fallstick's closings are clear. At 95, there's no mention from the council per se to the master plan on the basis that it's not agreed. That was consistent with Mr. James's approach, of course, which is to say that the lack of agreement does not lead to conflict with Policy 36 when read as a whole. Next heading, sir. There is a need and a demand for each of the proposed units. In the end, and I say in the end because, as I've said in the footnote, notwithstanding insistence on a roundtable exercise on pipeline, which was time wasted because we agree that however large this pipeline is, it's not large enough to meet the council's needs, and pages of Mr. Bennett's proof being dedicated to attempting to show there was no need for the B8 units in the scheme. Anyway, in the end, Mr. Bennett and Mr. Ward accepted there is a need and demand for each of the proposed units, not just the B2 ones, the B8 ones as well. Mr. Bolton explained that the council's HENA shows there's a strong demand for non-strat B8 than for B2, which matched up with Mr. Harvey's evidence experience on the ground. As Mr. Bennett put it, the need for strategic B8 in this area is insatiable, but he agreed the need for non-strat B8 is also vast. The only evidence as to current need is contained within the HENA, which puts that need in excess of 440,000 square metres. For sites coming down the pipeline, Mr. Bolton added together intended floor space where there's a clear intention expressed for or reserved matters application or in a design and access statement, and We note that the council ignored or overlooked expressed intentions, conducted their own figures exercise. And secondly, Mr. Bolton considered an assumed floor space where there's no clear intention, using Iceni's assumption that 25% in those circumstances will come forward as non-strat BA. And on those basis of those assumptions, he identifies a shortfall of some 272,976 square metres of non-strategic B8 floor space. Now, 3 consequences flow from the parties' agreed position that there is a need and a demand for each of the units proposed. The first is that the agreed need and demand picture reinforces our interpretation of policy 36. It shows that the objective at 8.12 of the core strategy has been met, that the allocation is still capable of accommodating a scheme which is attractive to the market to provide sufficient choice and flexibility. In short, on our approach, if you allow this appeal, it would be an example of the policy functioning in exactly the way the core strategy intended. That's the first. The second consequence of the agreed need is that in the event that the council's interpretation of small scale is preferred by you, if you think it means what they say it means, the agreed need and demand picture reveals that policy 36 is now out of date. As Mr. Bolton explained, the requirements of the policy would in that world be inconsistent with the evidence as to what's actually required. In that world, less weight would be given to any conflict with it. Third, irrespective of how you end up interpreting small-scale B8, it follows from the agreed need and demand picture that you've got before you, sir, a scheme which offers significant benefits. Mr. Bennett accepted that the B2 unit is a significant benefit of the proposal. He accepted that because there's a need and demand for each of the units, that there be 8, significant weight should be given to this benefit too. All of this, of course, flatly inconsistent with Mr. Forstick's idea that it's impossible to understand why B8 units should come forward on the side. Mr. James goes further, giving those benefits very significant weight. Mr. Bennett agreed that the B8 uses proposed in this scheme will deliver high quality employment as recognised in the core strategy, which tells us, the plan tells us, that B8 development can deliver high value employment through providing higher paid jobs. The deprecation of the quality of those jobs in both the cases of the council and the Rule 6 party, as in Mr. Stinchcombe's words, the wrong kind of jobs, is completely unevidenced and directly and expressly contrary to the development plan. In Mr. Forstick's case, the submission he makes at 63 about B8 providing the wrong kind of jobs is also directly contrary to the evidence of his own witness. It's also, with respect, implies a certain complacency as to the position this council finds itself in. Those jobs targets were ambitious. They've not even nearly been met. This is an area which the plan confirms requires all kinds of new jobs in very high numbers to right historic shortfalls under the previous local plan, including the higher value employment which the plan expects to be delivered by B8. This scheme will deliver many much needed jobs towards those ambitious targets which are still, as Mr. Bolton explained, many thousands of jobs short of being met. Over the next 10 years, it will account for almost 2,400 jobs and a net present value of almost £360 million. Mr. James is right to give these economic benefits very significant weight. Mr. Forstick, in his closings, tries to deprecate the value of those benefits with reference to a non-existent alternative B1, B2 focused scheme. Council's not put before the inquiry and is only recently decided as called for by the policy. Benefits are real. They're not to be deprecated as gross, quote unquote, benefits when you have, sir, a binary choice. You either grant permission for this scheme or you refuse it. There's no third way. Next heading, the landscape impacts are as expected. In relation to the landscape baseline, there's considerable common ground. In particular, Ms. Webber agreed that the site is not subject to landscape designations of any kind, national, regional, local. It's not a valued landscape within the meaning of the framework. The site's context is one of large industrial buildings. Ms. Webber agreed that that context will soon be one of even more large industrial buildings, and that's because immediately to the south of the site, and of course within the Policy 36 area, the council consented phase 2 of the I.M. Kelly scheme, which will add another 8,000 795 square metres of manufacturing and warehousing circled in yellow in the picture, and an existing 9,278 square metres of warehousing circled in blue. The council considered that this new building, Iron Kelly Phase 2, which is larger than each of the appeal scheme's B8 units, would have only a, quote, marginal impact both on visual amenity and on landscape character, which would be, so they thought, acceptable. Iron Kelly Phase 2, as I've said, falls within the boundary of Policy 36. It forms part of the same allocation as we do, and it's subject to exactly the same policy requirements. The changes do not, of course, stop there. Ms Webber accepted the council's positive intention is that the appeal site will undergo enormous change. She agreed that landscape character and visual effects are inevitable. The proposals are supported by a landscape and visual impact assessment, which found the scheme to be acceptable in landscape and visual terms. Mrs Brockhurst reviewed the LVIA. She confirmed it complies with the relevant guidance, and the council don't disagree. Mrs Brockhurst's evidence builds on the analysis of the LVIA, and she concludes, in short, that the character of the site is already strongly peri-urban and that its visual envelope is relatively small, and that changes which the appeal scheme will give rise to are no different than those expected when the site was allocated. And Ms Webber has not carried out an LVIA-style analysis. She's not even explained her methodology. She made a number of criticisms of the scheme, but with respect, each one of them went nowhere. First, she suggested that the scheme is not landscape-led, but as Mrs Brockhurst explained, the design development brief shows you how the landscape constraints were factored in to the design process. The scheme is landscape-led on a macro scale in the sense that the development's been located in the part of the landscape which has the greatest carrying capacity, which is to say away from the particular constraints to the south and also to the east. Ms Webber also suggested that the revised scheme is compressed, as she called it. The units were, of course, only brought closer together in order to retain 4 hectares of woodland at the council's request, which is something Ms Webber agreed is a significant win. Of course, so very many of the residents who have spoken over the course of the inquiry focused their representations on the local value of that woodland, all of which is now being retained by this scheme. A significant win, you'd thought, for them too. Ms Webber gave evidence in relation to the size and height of the B8 unit. She accepted that this part of her evidence is predicated on the council's interpretation of small-scale B8 being correct. If the council's interpretation is wrong, which it is, then that part of her evidence falls away. The oddity of the council's case is exposed by the fact that it positively welcomes the largest unit in this scheme, which is the B2 unit. That's described by Mr Bennett as a significant benefit. In opening, the council accepted the allocation allows for B1, B2 buildings that are large, and indeed its complaint now seems to be that there's only one large B2 unit, which Mr Forstick tells us strongly welcomed, when the council would have liked to have seen more B2. When asked whether the impact on landscape or visual receptors would be reduced on account of this unit being a B2 unit rather than a B8 unit, Ms Webber said that she would prefer not to answer. An obvious, glaring inconsistency in the council's approach to this inquiry. The response? Silence. In the end, Ms Webber's evidence hinged on her desire to retain a number of different things. Firstly, the woodland. Secondly, the root protection areas. Thirdly, the glade character of the meadow part of the site. She wants to retain everything. There is, however, no evidence that the allocation could ever be brought forward with those 3 things retained on the site, particularly given the landscape sensitivities that Ms Brockhurst explained, and her evidence on the remaining parts of the allocation site. The council's not put forward, I've said this already, any alternative view to consider, sir, albeit Mrs Brockhurst is somehow criticised for failing to assess a, quote, B1, B2 focused scheme that doesn't exist and that the council only recently decided the allocation calls for, nor has anyone else. Yes, there will be change to the landscape, but change is positively intended by this council, and so while Mr James acknowledges that there'll be harm to the open quality of the appeal site, he's right to give that only moderate weight. Next, sir, biodiversity. The scheme will deliver biodiversity benefits. The appeal scheme has been robustly surveyed over many years. Its baseline ecological condition is well understood. It's not subject to any statutory designations for nature conservation. It does not include any, quote, irreplaceable habitats like ancient woodland, although members of the public have referred to ancient woodland. The closest bit of ancient woodland is 230 metres away. There's no objection to the scheme from Natural England. There's no objection to from the council on any ecology grounds. Contrary to the picture that's been painted by the Rule 6 party, the proposals ensure that much of the relevant habitats will be retained, or the Weekley Hall Wood and Quarry Local Wildlife Site, LWS, will be retained. Almost all of the Cherry Hall Plantation, LWS, will be retained, with only 0.05 hectares of woodland removed to facilitate, at the council's insistence, the construction of a new footpath. More than a hectare of grassland will be retained. Mr Goodwin confirmed that with appropriate management, this grassland could attain the level of botanical interest currently seen in the northeastern section of the site. And note that he confirmed that as the site is currently unmanaged, over time the element of scrub will only increase, which will result in the overall ecological value of the grassland decreasing. Of course, some grassland will be lost. Mr Goodwin explained that that is inevitable. This is a site that's got on it woodland and it's got grassland. That's it. If you decide to protect all the woodland, as we have, then at least some of the grassland is going to be lost. That's particularly so given the raft of other environmental constraints to which the eastern parts of the allocation is subject. There was no, as Mr Stinchcombe now puts it, quote, lurching straight to compensation. You've heard loads of evidence on how impacts are avoided where they can be, e.g. to the woodland and to the areas of grassland which are being retained. Areas of grassland, the loss of which is being avoided. Albeit you wouldn't know it from Mr Stinchcombe's closings, but the allocation is such that the first step of the mitigation hierarchy in the framework, which to avoid, was never going to be enough. The other two steps, mitigate and compensate, were always going to be required. That there are, of course, other site constraints which cannot be dealt with by things like compensation, e.g. if all of the grassland were retained on this site and most or all of this development were pushed into the phase 2 area, any landscape, visual or heritage impacts associated with that change cannot be dealt with by compensation. Mr Stinchcombe's submission to you in his closings at 31, which is that the meadows loss should be avoided, quote, regardless of the site's allocation in policy 36, gives away the real nature of his objection. Because for all his rhetoric about the importance of a, quote, plan-led system, the truth is that his case, and to be fair, that of the vast majority of the group for which he speaks, asks you to set aside the allocation, its obvious implications for the grassland altogether. This is a plan-led scheme, and let's just call a spade a spade. The real issue for Mr Stinchcombe's clients is they objected and still object to policy 36, full stop. In any event, Mr Stinchcombe's closings on this topic go far, far beyond what is contained in his own client's evidence. He says at 83 of his closings what he calls a breach of the mitigation hierarchy, which is obviously not accepted for the reasons that Mr Goodwin's explained. He says that it compels refusal. He might think so, but 180 of the framework is not even mentioned in Mr Crook's evidence, let alone is it said that the operation of 180 compels you to reach one decision or another. So Mr Stinchcombe's new point has not actually been explored with any of the planning witnesses, but in any event, it's wrong. 180 of the framework only suggests refusal in circumstances where it's not been possible to avoid, mitigate or compensate for any significant harm to biodiversity. But as Mr Goodwin explained, and indeed as the Council accepts, this scheme does all three. So far as species are concerned, Mr Goodwin explained that more than enough information was gathered to yield a robust and reliable baseline and to allow for accurate assessments to be made, whilst criticisms are levelled at methodology. Followed for almost all surveys that have been undertaken, it should be noted that, as Mr Goodwin explained, it doesn't actually change the results of the existing assessment work, and in many of the cases the conclusions of the assessment are ultimately accepted. Of course, there's no objection in relation to impact on species from the Council or from Natural England. Through the adoption of appropriate mitigation and compensation measures, which are informed by the results of extensive survey work, the scheme is going to avoid adverse effects and in fact deliver biodiversity benefits overall. Indeed, the Council accepts that the scheme will deliver a 1,230 74% increase to hedgerow units, and a biodiversity net gain of 13.3%. The works to achieve that will come forward in accordance with the management plan to be submitted to the council prior to commencement and approved by the council prior to occupation. The management plan will include details of the works, a methodology, a management strategy and a programme. Once the grassland is properly recognised as lowland meadow, the BNG goes up to 22.8%, with Mr Goodwin noting that the use of BNG metric 4 would actually push that up even higher. 75% more lowland meadow is going to be provided than that which will be lost. That is, Mr Goodwin explained, a generous bespoke compensation scheme. Mr James noted that 10% BNG requirement is not in force and wouldn't in any event apply to this scheme, but in any event would exceed it, so he accordingly gives the ecological benefits of the scheme significant weight. Next, sir, the scheme offers enhanced connectivity and excellent public transport. The council's highways case has narrowed considerably. Council no longer takes any points in relation to highways capacity after reason for refusal 5 was withdrawn. It agrees that the highways contribution in the 106 will mitigate the impact of the scheme on the existing highway network to satisfy limb B of the allocation policy. Council agrees the scheme will be served by excellent public transport links within the meaning of C of the allocation policy. The existing X4 bus service, to use Ms Holland's words, covers a good span of time with half-hourly services between 7 AM and 7 PM and further services outside that window. Mr Shepherd explained that the modal shift will be encouraged through the provision of bus passes and personalised travel planning sessions for staff. The 106 agreement makes provision for the installation and maintenance of 2 new bus shelters, and the council's satisfied that the form of the new crossing on Weekley Avenue can be dealt with by condition reason for refusal 7 has on that basis been withdrawn. Only a narrow point remains that one element of 2 limbs of the allocation policy, limbs A and C, requires vehicular access from and new pedestrian cycling routes to be connected to Weekley Lane. There's no requirement, however, for this route and this access to be delivered now. Mr Bennett accepted that the allocation policy allows for the development to be delivered in phases, and that there's no requirement for all of the allocations components to come forward at the same time. All we need to show for now is that the first phase doesn't prejudice the delivery of the rest, and we've done that. We have provided details of potential access locations along Weekley Lane, including a controlled crossing linking the existing public rights of way on either side. Mr Shepherd explained that providing access through the remainder of the allocation site as part of the appeal scheme would not materially enhance connectivity. A new pedestrian route would only be 3 minutes quicker than the existing route to the residential neighbourhood to the south of Weekley Lane, and would be unlikely to be used to access bus services, given that the existing bus stops on the A43 by Weekley Avenue are closer and benefit from more frequent services to a broader range of local centres. So the appeal site is not, as Mr Forster describes it in his closings, even remotely isolated. The scheme will, however, provide an estate road, footpath, cycleway to connect the appeal site to phase 2. This will ensure connection with Weekley Lane can be achieved and linked into the current phase, and it will also provide an extension to the combined footway cycleway along Weekley Avenue, with an independent combined footway and cycleway linking Weekley Avenue to the site access road to ensure continuous routes both for pedestrians and cyclists between the appeal site and the existing infrastructure along the A43, including local bus stops. The scheme therefore accords with the policy. It improves connectivity to the part of the site now being developed along the A43. It leaves the door open to a further improvements when the rest of the allocation comes forward along Weekley Lane. Now, Ms Holland, nonetheless, went on to suggest how, in her view, the scheme could be improved. First, she suggested that the new bus shelters could include real-time passenger information system. It's not something the Council's Highways Authority requested. In any event, Mr Draper of the Highways Authority explained there's something of a move away from real-time information systems in bus shelters, as smartphones tend to be more reliable. As Mr Shepherd said, in this case, information provision measures will be secured through the travel plan, which could include, for example, a website with real-time travel updates. Next, Ms Holland suggested that separate provision should be made for cyclists and pedestrians rather than a combined footway and cycleway. but Mr. Shepherd explained maintaining the same environment across the route is actually better for pedestrians. Changing from one environment to another, so from the existing shared route to a single use across this stretch, will be less safe. The flows will not in any event be high and certainly be well below the flows referred to in LTM 120. Ms Holland also expressed concern that other travel plans for other schemes have not been adequately implemented or monitored. However, in this case, the development is required to be carried out in accordance with the travel plan. £5,000 monitoring contributions secured in the 106. The draft plan includes a monitoring review strategy with a mechanism for the council to input in the event that targets aren't being met. The scheme promoter will have a continual role as a site-wide travel plan coordinator, and finally, tenants will act as travel plan champions, will be subject to travel plan related obligations under their tenancy obligations. None of Ms Holland's points provide a valid basis for dismissing the appeal. There are no transport or highway related harms, only benefits. Mr James gives them moderate weight. So finally, the planning balance weighs decisively in favour of allowing the appeal. In the end, sir, albeit you wouldn't know it from the convoluted legalistic contortions of the council's position, the planning analysis in this case is straightforward. The appeal scheme accords with the allocation policy. There's no material conflict with any other policy. The scheme accords with the plan when read as a whole. There are no material considerations which would justify determining the appeal otherwise than in accordance with the relevant plan. The appeal should be allowed. Now, even if we are wrong about that, the appeal should still be allowed. And that's because even if there were a conflict with the plan, Mr James made clear that other material considerations would justify the grant of permission. Do note briefly in the footnote that Mr Forsdick's position appears to be that the policies that the conflict that he alleges with the policy is fatal to the appeal. You say that that logic is inconsistent both with the way that section 38.6 works, and it's also inconsistent in the way that you've defined the main issue for the appeal earlier on this morning. Now, on the one side of the scales, Mr James explained that the benefits associated with delivering B2 and B8 uses would weigh very heavily. And indeed, the council agreed. The council gives those benefits significant weight. Mr James gives very significant weight, both to the economic benefits and to the delivery of employment floor space towards unmet demand. The scheme has agreed to have other benefits too, including the ecological benefits, to which Mr James gives significant weight, as you've heard. Mr Forsdick's questions in cross-examination and now in his closings refer to this idea of need for B2 units somehow trumping need for B8. Just to be clear, that idea is not supported by any evidence before the inquiry, including from his own witnesses. It's hard to understand where it's come from. It was certainly nowhere in any of his witnesses' proofs that oral evidence the council stated the case, the putative reasons for refusal or his opening statement. But one thing's for sure, for all the many, many things which Mr Forsdick says are questions of law, this one's not. The weight to attribute to different benefits is a matter for the planners. It's not a matter for the lawyers. And not one of the planners has developed this line of one kind of need, quote, trumping the other. On the other side of the scales, conflict with policy 36 should be given less weight, because in this world, as Mr Bolton's explained, in a world where the council's interpretation is accepted by you, the policy becomes out of date. There's also harm to landscape, but as Ms Webber agreed, landscape character and visual effects are inevitable, and Mr James gives the landscape harm only moderate weight. Taken together, in the end, the benefits clearly outweigh the harms. For those reasons, sir, we ask you to allow the appeal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Simons. I'll take a quick canter through the documents that have been submitted so that you're clear what I've got in addition to the proof for documents. We've got the tree height analysis.
Sorry, is that okay?
Tree height analysis, that was the line there. Heights of neighbouring buildings, business park unit sizes and occupiers. Unit dimensions, that's the appeal scheme. The map of the local wildlife sites and the original application layout. The Maron's Matter 5 background paper. The industrial and logistics market to 2014, that's the Lambert Smith Hampton report. The Council for the Preservation of Rural England representations. Submission by Mr. P. Hollowbone MP. Submissions by Mrs. McGinn, Mrs. Anstey and Mr. Todd. And then there's a bundle of representations from the evening session. We've got the revised Section 106 agreement, the revised Civil Regulation 122 schedule, an email confirming acceptance of the pre-commencement conditions, and then submissions by D. Paramchuk and D. Focus Sherman and Maria Lowe, and finally agreed list of conditions. That covers all the additional documents that were submitted.
Do you want a hard copy of, obviously you'll get one in due course, do you want a hard copy of the 106 as it is today in agreed form? You had it over email, but I don't know.
No, I'm okay with the email.
Right, copy. No, nothing else on that we can.
Yes, I wasn't going to treat those as inquiry documents. They're there as I should use the word inverted commas to assist me. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much for all your assistance. The accommodation has been 99% good, but can I make the suggestion that the council use some of its limited budget? For goodness sake, get some decent microphones, because it has made things difficult, particularly for people who want to follow the inquiry at a distance, and for those who have to sit at the back of the room throughout most of the time. Is there anything else that you want to raise?
No, sir, thank you very much.
There being no application for costs?
No, sir.
Thank you very much.